What if the first kings of Earth never claimed to invent their throne, but only to inherit it? Beneath the ruins of southern Mesopotamia, where irrigation channels once carved order into chaos, clay tablets still preserve a memory older than empire. Each wedge pressed into wet earth 4 millennia ago carried the weight of inheritance, records not of triumph but of succession, of stepping into a world already measured, already governed, already complete. So before the silence deepens, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you're drawn to histories that question what we think we know about beginnings. And if you're still listening, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I'd like to imagine this quiet stretching across the world as the past whispers through the present. The story begins not with invention, but with excavation. In 1849, British diplomat Austen Henry Layard uncovered fragments of cuneiform tablets near the ancient city of Nineveh, among the debris of collapsed libraries. He found something that should not have existed: a chronicle listing kings who ruled before the Great Flood, their reigns stretching tens of thousands of years. The document was clinical, bureaucratic even, written in the same accounting style used for grain stores and temple inventories. It was called the Sumerian King List, and it opened with words that still unsettle the timeline we've constructed for ourselves. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not invented, not seized, not earned, descended. The tablet did not describe humans claiming power for the first time. It described them receiving an office that already existed, passed down from rulers whose names appeared alongside impossible reign lengths. 43,200 years for one king, 36,000 for another. Scholars have spent more than a century trying to explain those numbers away as metaphor, as symbolic inflation, as scribal error. But the scribes did not treat them as metaphor. They recorded these reigns in the same tone they used to measure barley and count cattle. No mythological embellishment, no divine poetry, just names, cities, and durations listed as though copying from an archive they believed to be factual. Layard couldn't have known what he'd found. The wedge-shaped characters pressed into clay fragments were still being deciphered in the 1840s. Cuneiform was a ghost language, spoken by no one, remembered by nothing except the baked earth of ancient cities. He shipped crates of tablets back to the British Museum where they sat in storage for years, waiting for scholars to develop the linguistic tools necessary to read what had been preserved in silence for millennia. When the translation finally came, it was worse than myth. Myths can be dismissed. Myths carry the obvious embellishments of oral tradition, the exaggerations of storytelling, the symbolic weight of cultural memory compressed into narrative. But this was different. This read like a tax document, like a legal transfer of authority, like the minutes from an administrative meeting that happened before history was supposed to have begun. The most complete version of the king list wasn't found at Nineveh. It came from Larsa, another Mesopotamian city, excavated in the early 20th century by a team that unearthed a clay prism, four-sided, approximately 8 inches tall, covered entirely in cuneiform script. Catalogued as WB444, now held in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, the object is unremarkable in appearance. Brown clay, uniform wedge marks, The kind of artifact that might sit unnoticed in a museum case if you didn't know what it said. What it says is this: before the flood swept over the earth, 8 kings ruled in 5 cities for a combined total of 241,200 years. The prism lists them by name. In Eridu, Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Then Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. In Bad Tabaira, 3 kings, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, and the divine Dumuzi, ruled for 43,200, 28,800, and 36,000 years respectively. In Larak, Ensipadzidana ruled for 28,800 years. In Sipar, Enmedurana ruled for 21,000 years. And in Shurupak, Ubartutu ruled for 18,600 years. Then the flood swept over. The text doesn't elaborate. It doesn't describe the waters rising or the heavens opening. It doesn't moralize or explain. It simply notes the event as a boundary marker, the way an accountant might note the end of a fiscal period. After the flood swept over, kingship descended from heaven again, this time to Kish, and the reign lengths changed. The first post-flood king, Gar, ruled for 1,200 years. Still impossible by modern human standards, but a fraction of what came before. The numbers continued descending through subsequent rulers: 960 years, 840 years, 720 years, until they reach lifespans that seem almost human. 100 years, 90 years, 40 years. Something had changed. Something had ended. The age of cosmic administration gave way to the age of mortal governance, but the institution itself, kingship, survived the transition. Hold that thought about those numbers. Because when we examine the actual physical evidence from the cities mentioned in the king list, the mathematics start to align with something we weren't expecting. Every city named in the pre-flood section has been excavated. Eridu, the first city where kingship descended from heaven, lies in southern Iraq near the modern town of Abu Shahran. Archaeologists have been digging there since the 1940s, and what they found beneath the sand confirms something extraordinary. Eridu is one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in Mesopotamia, with occupation layers dating back to approximately 5,400 BCE. The city grew around a temple complex dedicated to Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom and fresh water, and that complex was rebuilt repeatedly on the exact same foundation over thousands of years. 18 successive temple structures, each one built directly atop the ruins of its predecessor, each one maintaining the same orientation, the same sacred geometry, the same relationship to the surrounding landscape. By the time the temple reached its final form in the 3rd millennium BCE, it sat atop 17 previous versions of itself, an architectural palimpsest preserving nearly 3,000 years of continuous ritual activity. This is restoration, not innovation. The later builders didn't choose new ground. They didn't experiment with new orientations. They excavated down to the old foundations and rebuilt what had been before, maintaining a continuity of sacred space that transcended individual lifetimes, individual dynasties, even individual iterations of the city itself. Bad Tabaira, the second city in the king list, has also been located and excavated. Modern Tel al-Madain in Iraq. Like Eridu, it shows evidence of settlement stretching back into the 5th millennium BCE. Larak, the third city, remains more obscure, possibly modern Tel al-Wilaya, though the identification is tentative. But Sippar, the fourth city, is well documented. Located near modern Baghdad, Sippar was a major cult center for Shamash, the sun god, and its temple archives have yielded thousands of cuneiform tablets. Among them are astronomical texts of stunning precision, star catalogs that track planetary movements across centuries, mathematical tables that solve problems in geometry and algebra. And Shurupak, the fifth city, the last before the flood, that site proved the most revealing of all. When archaeologists excavated Shurupak in the early 20th century, they found something that changed everything. At a depth corresponding roughly to the late 4th millennium BCE, they encountered a layer of clean silt. No pottery fragments, no tools, no ash from fires or debris from collapsed buildings. Just sterile, water-deposited sediment 8 to 11 feet thick depending on the excavation trench, interrupting the occupation layers like a held breath. Above the silt, the city rebuilt itself. Below the silt, evidence of sophisticated urban life, streets, houses, temple complexes, irrigation systems. The flood was not mythological convenience. It was stratigraphic fact. Something catastrophic had happened. Water had come. Settlement had stopped. And then, after the waters receded, the survivors returned and began again. But here's what they didn't do. They didn't start over as primitives relearning civilization from scratch. The post-flood layers at Shurupak show immediate resumption of advanced urban planning. The irrigation channels follow the same geometric patterns as the pre-flood channels. The temple is rebuilt on the old temple's foundation. The pottery styles show continuity, not disruption. And, most tellingly, the cuneiform tablets found in the post-flood levels demonstrate full literacy, not the hesitant pictographs of a writing system being invented, but the confident administrative script of a society that already knows how to keep records, manage resources, and preserve knowledge across generations. The scribes who wrote the Sumerian king list were working from this institutional memory. They were copying older sources that had survived the flood in some form, whether as earlier tablets preserved in temple archives or as oral traditions maintained by priestly lineages, or as both. And they recorded what those sources said without attempting to rationalize the numbers, without converting the pre-flood rain lengths into something more palatable to later understanding. This is where the administrative tone becomes important. When a Sumerian scribe wanted to tell a mythological story, the language changed. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, is full of poetic devices, repeated epithets, dramatic dialogue, symbolic imagery. It reads like literature because it was literature, composed and refined over centuries by scribes who understood the difference between historical record and mythic narrative. The king list doesn't read like that. It reads like a succession document, like a constitutional record maintaining the chain of authority from the beginning of governance to the present moment. The scribe who compiled the Weld-Blundell prism around 2100 BCE was working in the court of Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, a king who was obsessed with legitimacy and legal continuity. Ur-Nammu produced the oldest known law code, a systematic enumeration of legal principles that established him as the upholder of justice and order. He needed to demonstrate that his kingship was legitimate, that it connected backward through time to the original descent of kingship from heaven. So the scribe went to the archives. He consulted older king lists preserved in various cities, Nippur, Larsa, Kish, Lagash. He compared versions. He compiled a master list that established the succession from the mythic past to the contemporary present, showing how kingship had passed from city to city, dynasty to dynasty, through flood and catastrophe, always maintaining the institutional continuity that validated Ur-Nammu's claim to rule. This wasn't propaganda. Or rather, it was propaganda grounded in what the scribes believed to be factual records. They weren't inventing a past. They were preserving one. The impossible reign lengths weren't symbolic exaggerations. They were numbers copied faithfully from sources the scribes treated as archival truth, even when those numbers described a world that no longer matched their own experience of mortal kingship. And here's where the silence begins to hum with implication. Because those numbers, 43,200 years, 36,000 years, 28,800 years, aren't random. They're multiples of 60. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, base 60 mathematics, the same framework we still use to measure time and angles, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. The pre-flood rain lengths are expressions of that system at cosmic scale. 43,200 is 60 times 60 times 12. 36,000 is 60 times 60 times 10. 28,800 is 60 times 60 times 8. These numbers suggest not random mythological inflation, but systematic calculation. They suggest someone was measuring deep time using the same mathematical framework that governed their measurement of everything else. Grain yields, field dimensions, water flow, planetary cycles. Which raises a question the king list doesn't answer, but can't help asking. Who was doing the measuring? Who maintained observations across time scales that dwarf individual human lifespans? Who kept the records that allowed these numbers to be calculated, preserved, and eventually copied onto clay tablets by scribes who treated them as inherited data rather than invented myth? The king list gives us names, Alulim, Alalgar, and Menluana, but it doesn't tell us what those names meant. Were they individuals, dynasties, institutional titles passed from generation to generation? The text treats them as kings, as rulers, as administrators of a political order that predated the flood. But the timescales suggest something else, something longer than individual lives. Something that required continuity of observation and record-keeping across periods measured not in years, but in millennia. And then the flood came, and the records survived, and the survivors rebuilt, and the scribes kept copying. In the temple archives at Nippur, excavated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists found thousands of cuneiform tablets, administrative documents, temple accounts, mathematical exercises, star catalogs, and among them, dedicatory inscriptions from the Reconstruction period following catastrophic flooding around 2900 BCE. One phrase appears repeatedly in these rebuilding texts: pressed into the clay foundations of new temple walls. This is the restoration of what was before, not foundation, not innovation. Restoration. The choice of words is deliberate. In Sumerian, the language distinguishes clearly between building something new and restoring something old. The temples at Nippur were being rebuilt on older foundations, using older plans, maintaining older orientations. The builders weren't creating, they were continuing. They were inheriting a template that preceded them, executing a design that had been interrupted but not forgotten. This is what the king list preserves, not just a chronicle of rulers, but a record of institutional memory, the knowledge that civilization itself is inheritance, not invention, that the tools of governance, the technologies of administration, the frameworks of mathematics and astronomy and law all descend from a previous order. That kingship came from heaven, not in the sense of divine intervention, but in the sense of being handed down from a time before, passed through catastrophe by those who remembered how the system worked. The scribes who copied the king list didn't understand everything they were copying. How could they? They lived in a world of mortal kings ruling for decades, not millennia. They lived after the flood, in the age of human administration, maintaining records of an age that preceded them by thousands of years. But they copied faithfully. They preserved the numbers even when the numbers seemed impossible. They maintained the administrative tone even when the content described something beyond their direct experience, because that was their job, not to interpret, not to rationalize, not to edit the past into something more believable, but to preserve it, to carry forward the archive that had been carried forward to them, to ensure that whoever came after would know what had come before. The clay is still damp in my mind. I can see the scribe's hand, fingers pressing the stylus into wet earth, forming wedge after wedge, copying from an older tablet that was itself copied from something older still. The oil lamp flickers. The temple is quiet. Outside, the Euphrates flows southward toward the sea, carrying silt from the mountains, building the delta one season at a time, the way the scribe is building the record one line at a time. He doesn't question the numbers. He doesn't pause to wonder how Olulim could have ruled for 28,800 years. That's not his concern. His concern is accuracy, preservation, making sure the copy matches the source, the way the rebuilt temple matches the old foundation. He is maintaining continuity across time. He is performing the same function the king list describes, carrying forward kingship, carrying forward governance, carrying forward the administrative order that descended from heaven and survived the flood and continues into his present moment. When he finishes, the tablet will be baked, the clay will harden, the words will become permanent, and 4,000 years later, archaeologists will excavate those words from the ruins of Nippur and Larsa and Nineveh, and scholars will translate them, and we will read them, and we will face the same questions the scribe never had to ask, because he already knew the answer. What descended from heaven? Knowledge, administration, the architecture of civilization, and who carried it forward through the flood? Those who remembered, those who preserved, those who rebuilt on the old foundations and called it restoration, not invention. The king list is their testimony. 8 kings before the flood. 241,200 years of governance. then water, then survival, then rebuilding, then a new age of mortal kings inheriting an immortal system. But the system remembered where it came from. The system maintained the record. The system inscribed on clay tablets and baked them into permanence, so that even after empires fell and languages died and cities returned to sand, the memory would remain. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not created, descended, inherited, restored. The British archaeologist Leonard Woolley arrived in southern Iraq in 1922 with a simple mission: excavate the ancient city of Ur, legendary birthplace of Abraham, and document what remained of one of humanity's earliest urban centers. What he found instead was evidence of something that shouldn't have been possible to verify. A catastrophe preserved in geological silence. Woolley's team dug down through the occupation layers of Ur methodically, cataloging pottery styles, architectural remains, and artifact assemblages as they descended through time. At approximately 11 feet below the surface, they hit a stratum of pure clay, clean, sterile, water-deposited silt with no cultural debris mixed in, no pottery shards, no tool fragments, no ash from cooking fires, no bones, nothing that indicated human habitation, just earth that had settled from floodwater. The layer was 8 feet thick. Woolley kept digging through it, expecting to hit bedrock or virgin soil, the natural ground upon which the first settlers of Ur had built their city. But beneath the silt, he found something else. Another occupation layer. Houses, streets, pottery. The remains of an earlier city, buried under the flood deposit and forgotten. He had found the boundary, the physical interruption that separated one age from another, the geological proof that something catastrophic had happened here, something violent enough to bury an entire urban settlement under 8 feet of water-deposited sediment. Woolley wasn't working in isolation. Other excavations in Mesopotamia during the 1920s and 1930s were uncovering the same pattern. At Kish, another ancient Sumerian city, archaeologist Stephen Langdon found a similar flood layer dated to approximately the same period, late 4th millennium BCE, around 2900 BCE. At Shurupak, the German archaeologist Erich Schmidt documented flood deposits interrupting the occupation sequence. At Uruk, at Lagash, at Nippur, everywhere archaeologists dug deep enough, they found evidence of catastrophic flooding around the same chronological horizon. Not localized floods, not the routine seasonal inundations that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers brought every year, depositing rich silt on agricultural fields and necessitating the elaborate irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian civilization possible. This was something different, something that left sterile deposits thick enough to bury cities, something that interrupted the continuity of settlement across the entire region. The Sumerian king list had marked this event with brutal simplicity. Then the flood swept over. No elaboration, no mythology, just the notation of a boundary, the way an administrator might note the end of one accounting period and the beginning of another. And now, 3,000 years after the king list was compiled, 4,000 years after the event itself, archaeologists were finding the physical evidence, The clean silt layers that proved the flood was stratigraphic fact, not narrative invention. But here's where it changes. Because the question isn't whether the flood happened. The geological record confirms it did. The question is what happened after. When Woolley excavated through the flood layer at Ur and into the occupation levels above it, he expected to find evidence of primitive resettlement, crude shelters, simple pottery, the material culture of survivors rebuilding from nothing. That's what should happen after a civilization-ending catastrophe. Skills are lost, knowledge fragments, technology regresses. The survivors start over, relearning slowly what their ancestors knew. That's not what he found. The post-flood levels at Ur showed immediate resumption of sophisticated urban planning. The city that emerged above the silt layer had paved streets laid out in geometric patterns, monumental architecture, advanced pottery wheel technology, cylinder seals carved with intricate designs, and, most significantly, cuneiform writing, not proto-writing, not pictographic scratches struggling toward language, but fully developed script capable of recording complex administrative information, legal contracts, and mathematical calculations. The same pattern appeared at every excavated site. At Kish, the post-flood settlement showed advanced metallurgy, bronze tools and weapons, sophisticated casting techniques, standardized weights and measures. At Uruk, the famous White Temple was built in the immediate post-flood period, a massive structure requiring precise astronomical alignment, complex engineering, and coordinated labor from hundreds or thousands of workers. At Shuruppak, administrative tablets appeared in the earliest post-flood levels, documenting grain distributions, livestock counts, and worker rations, using the same accounting methods that had been used before the waters came. There was no regression, no dark age, no period of relearning. The survivors rebuilt as though they remembered exactly how everything had worked, as though the knowledge had been preserved intact through the catastrophe. Consider what that implies. A flood violent enough to bury cities under 8 to 11 feet of silt should have been devastating to human populations. The death toll would have been catastrophic, the displacement total, the infrastructure completely destroyed. Every building, every granary, every temple, every irrigation channel, obliterated by water and buried under sediment. And yet, within a generation, perhaps within years, the survivors were rebuilding complex urban societies with technological sophistication that matched or exceeded what came before. They weren't starting from scratch. They were continuing something, restoring something, inheriting something that had been preserved despite the catastrophe. How? The king list doesn't explain. It simply records the transition. After the flood swept over, kingship descended from heaven again, this time to Kish. The institutional structure survived. The administrative framework survived. Kingship itself, the organized governance that the pre-flood rulers had maintained for impossible spans of time, survived and resumed in a new location, with mortal rulers who inherited the same basic system. But the numbers changed. That's the detail that haunts every analysis of the king list. Before the flood, reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns measured in hundreds of years, then gradually declining toward human lifespans. The first post-flood king, Gaur of Kish, ruled for 1,200 years. His successor Gula ruled for 960 years. Then Zukakip ruled for 840 years. The progression continues downward, 720, 600, 480, until by the middle of the early dynastic period, around 2500 BCE, the king list is recording reigns of 30, 40, 50 years. Plausible human lifespans, verifiable historical figures. Something fundamental changed at the flood boundary. The cosmic timescale of the antediluvian rulers gave way to the mortal timescale of historical kingship. But the institution persisted. The administrative structure persisted. The knowledge that made civilization possible, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, architecture, agriculture, persisted without interruption, despite the physical interruption of the flood. This is what the archaeological evidence confirms. When we excavate the flood layers at Ur, at Kish, at Shuruppak, we find continuity of culture across the boundary. The pottery styles evolve continuously from pre-flood to post-flood, without sudden breaks that would indicate population replacement. The architectural traditions continue. Temples built on the same sacred geometry. Irrigation systems following the same engineering principles. City layouts maintaining the same organizational logic. Most tellingly, the mathematical and astronomical knowledge shows no interruption whatsoever. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, base 60 mathematics, that appears fully formed in the earliest post-flood texts we can read, not being invented, not being developed, already there, already functioning as the framework for all quantitative thought, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 60 minutes of arc in a degree, 360 degrees in a circle. The same system the pre-flood rain lengths are multiples of. The same system we still use 4,000 years later. Where did it come from? The standard academic answer is that it emerged organically from Sumerian culture, that they chose base 60 because it has many divisors, making it convenient for fractions and commercial calculations. But that explanation assumes the Sumerians invented the system. It doesn't account for why the system appears already complete, already standardized across multiple city-states, already embedded in astronomical observations that required centuries of careful record-keeping to compile. The King list offers a different explanation, though it never states it explicitly. The system descended from heaven. It was inherited from the pre-flood age. It survived the catastrophe because someone preserved it, whether in written form on tablets that were protected from the waters, or in oral form through priestly lineages that maintained knowledge across generations, or both. And when the waters receded, those who remembered began teaching those who survived. At Nippur, in the temple archives dedicated to Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, excavators found tablets that documented this process directly. Dating to the early 3rd millennium BCE, shortly after the flood horizon, these texts describe the rebuilding of the temple complex. One inscription, carved into a foundation stone and later copied onto clay tablets for the archive, states, "This is the restoration of what was before." The language is precise. In Sumerian, the word used is jai-for, to restore, to return, to make as it was. Not do, to build, to create, to make new. The scribes who recorded this inscription were explicit about what they were doing. They weren't founding a new temple. They were restoring an old one, rebuilding on the foundations that had been there before the flood, re-establishing the sacred space that had existed in the earlier age. The same language appears in rebuilding inscriptions from other sites. At Eridu, where kingship first descended from heaven, according to the king list, the excavations revealed 18 successive temple structures, built one atop another across 3,000 years. Each rebuilding maintained the exact same orientation, aligned to the cardinal directions with precision that required sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Each rebuilding preserved the same basic architectural plan. Each rebuilding invoked the same divine patronage. This was Enki's temple, god of wisdom and fresh water, and had been since before memory. The continuity is architectural proof of institutional memory. These weren't random rebuildings. They were deliberate acts of preservation. Each generation inherited a sacred template and maintained it faithfully, even when that meant excavating down through earlier ruins to find the original foundation stones and building upward from there, even when that meant preserving orientations that no longer aligned perfectly with contemporary astronomical observations, because precession had shifted the celestial pole over millennia. They were maintaining something older than themselves, something they believed had to be preserved exactly as it had been received. Now, watch what happens when we look at the irrigation systems. Before the flood, southern Mesopotamia had developed sophisticated water management. Canals, levees, reservoirs, and distribution networks that turned marsh and desert into productive agricultural land. These systems required extensive planning, precise surveying, and coordinated labor from entire communities. They required understanding of gradient flow, seasonal variation, siltation patterns, and crop water requirements. After the flood, the irrigation systems resumed immediately. Not simplified versions, not experimental attempts to relearn hydraulic engineering. Full-scale networks that matched the complexity and sophistication of what had come before. At Uruk, at Ur, at Lagash, the post-flood irrigation channels follow the same geometric patterns as the pre-flood channels, maintaining the same relationships to field systems, temple precincts, and urban centers. Someone knew how these systems worked. Someone had preserved the knowledge of their construction, operation, and maintenance. Someone taught the next generation how to survey the land, calculate the gradients, dig the channels at the proper depth and width, install the control gates, manage the seasonal flooding, prevent siltation, and distribute water equitably among competing agricultural users. This knowledge didn't survive by accident. It survived because it was preserved deliberately, maintained through catastrophe, by people who understood its value and knew how to transmit it intact to those who would rebuild. The king list calls these people kings. It assigns them to cities: Eridu, Bad Tabara, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. It records their names and their reign lengths and the succession from one to the next. And then it notes the flood. And then it records the resumption of kingship in new cities, with new rulers whose reign lengths descend gradually toward human lifespans. But beneath the narrative of political succession, the text is documenting something else. the transmission of knowledge across a catastrophic boundary, the preservation of civilization itself, the inheritance of everything that makes organized society possible: writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, architecture, agriculture, through a period that should have destroyed it all. The flood didn't destroy it. The flood interrupted it. And those who survived carried it forward. At Shuruppak, the city that held the last pre-flood king according to the king list, archaeologists found something that makes this transmission tangible. In the post-flood levels, dating to approximately 2800 BCE, they discovered tablets that appeared to be school exercises, student scribes learning to write by copying standard phrases and word lists. But the content of these exercises was ancient even then. They were copying texts that referred to pre-flood conditions, pre-flood gods, pre-flood administrative categories that no longer existed in their contemporary world. The students were learning to read the past. They were being trained to access the archive. They were inheriting a literacy that extended backward through the flood, connecting them to the administrative culture that had preceded them. This is how knowledge survives catastrophe, not through divine intervention, not through miraculous preservation, but through the deliberate effort of teachers and students, masters and apprentices, priests and scribes, who understand that what they know is valuable enough to preserve at any cost, even through the end of the world. The Sumerian king list is the product of that preservation. The scribes who compiled it around 2100 BCE were working from sources that had been copied and recopied across 1,000 years, sources that themselves were copies of earlier documents, sources that traced back through the flood to the archives of the pre-flood cities. They weren't inventing a mythology. They were maintaining a record, a constitutional document, a proof of legitimacy that connected contemporary kingship to the original descent of kingship from heaven. And the proof was geological. The flood had happened. The cities had been buried, and they had been rebuilt. The system had survived. The inheritance had been transmitted. Kingship had descended from heaven before the flood, and it had descended from heaven again after the flood, and it continued descending through every generation that followed, each king inheriting from his predecessor, each predecessor inheriting from the one before, back through time to the beginning of governance itself. The flood was the test, and civilization passed. But here's the question that remains unanswered in the silt layers, and the rebuilding inscriptions, and the mathematical tablets, and the astronomical texts. What exactly descended from heaven? What was the nature of this kingship that survived catastrophe? What was being inherited, transmitted, preserved at such cost? The king list doesn't explain. It simply records. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then the flood swept over. Then kingship descended from heaven again, this time to Kish. The mechanism isn't described. The source isn't identified. The text presents the descent of kingship as a given, as something that happened and continued happening, as the foundation upon which everything else rests. But the evidence suggests kingship was never just political authority. It was the entire administrative apparatus of civilization, the knowledge systems, the institutional structures, the accumulated wisdom that allowed human communities to organize at scale, to build cities, to manage resources, to maintain order across space and time. And that knowledge, according to the record preserved in clay and confirmed in stratigraphy, predated the flood, survived the flood, and resumed after the flood without interruption of its fundamental character, even as the timescale shifted from cosmic to human, even as the rulers changed from figures with impossible lifespans to historical kings whose reigns could be measured in decades. The archive remembers, the tablets preserve, and the silence between what they say and what they imply continues to deepen, layer by layer, like silt settling from floodwater, covering what came before, but never quite erasing it. 8 to 11 feet of sterile clay at Urartu, the same at Kish, the same at Shurupak. The boundary is clear, the catastrophe is confirmed, and on both sides of the boundary, the same civilization, the same knowledge, the same system of governance and administration and record-keeping continues. Interrupted, but not ended. Buried, but not forgotten. Inherited across the deepest silence history has ever known. The temple complex at Nippur sits in the center of what was once the religious heart of Sumer, even after the political capital shifted to Ur, to Uruk, to Babylon. Nippur remained sacred, the city of Enlil, lord of the air, keeper of the tablets of destiny, the god whose authority legitimized every earthly king. To rule Mesopotamia was to control Nippur's blessing. To rebuild Nippur's temple was to restore the connection between heaven and earth. In 1889, the University of Pennsylvania began systematic excavations at Nippur that would continue intermittently for more than a century. What they found beneath the sand wasn't just a temple. It was an archive. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, some dating back to the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, preserved in the dry earth of temple storerooms and priestly libraries, administrative documents, astronomical observations, mathematical tables, literary compositions, school texts, and among them, temple foundation records that documented every rebuilding, every restoration, every moment when the sacred structure had been renewed. One inscription appears repeatedly across multiple rebuilding phases, carved into foundation stones, copied onto dedicatory tablets, preserved in the Temple Chronicle. Ekur ugu deha. The mountain house is restored to its foundation. Ekur, the mountain house. That was Enlil's temple, but the phrase used isn't built or founded. It's restored. Ugudea, returned to what it was, made again as it had been before. The inscriptions don't claim innovation. They claim continuity. Each rebuilding was presented as an act of preservation, of maintaining the sacred architecture that had existed since kingship descended from heaven. The excavations confirmed this. Beneath the visible temple ruins, archaeologists found earlier structures. Beneath those, earlier still. Layer after layer of rebuilding, each one maintaining the same basic orientation, the same relationship to the cardinal directions, the same sacred geometry. When surveyors measured the alignment, they found something remarkable. The temple axis was oriented 45 degrees east of north, a deliberate choice that required astronomical observation and precise surveying. But more remarkable was that this orientation had been maintained across multiple rebuildings spanning more than 1,000 years. Even as precession slowly shifted the positions of stars, even as the relationship between celestial pole and horizon changed imperceptibly across centuries, the builders maintained the original alignment. They weren't orienting to contemporary astronomical observations. They were preserving an older orientation. They were building to match what had been before, not what they observed in their present moment. This is restoration as religious duty, as constitutional requirement, as the fundamental obligation of kingship itself to maintain what descended from heaven, to preserve the sacred template, to ensure continuity across time regardless of catastrophe, war, dynastic change, or cosmic shift. Keep that number in mind. Base 60. Because it appears in places it shouldn't, measuring things that need extraordinary precision. Among the tablets found at Nippur were astronomical texts called Mul-Apin, literally the plow star, named for the constellation they use as a reference point. These tablets contain star catalogs, lists of heliacal risings, tables of planetary movements, and calculations for predicting astronomical events. They represent one of humanity's earliest systematic attempts to map the heavens and understand celestial mechanics. The texts are written in the same bureaucratic tone as temple inventories. No mythological embellishment, no divine poetry, just observations, measurements, and calculations recorded with administrative precision. Star names, rising dates, positional measurements given in degrees, minutes, and seconds, all using base 60 notation. The same mathematical framework that governed grain accounting and land surveying was being applied to track planetary motions and stellar positions. But here's what makes the Mul-Apin tablets unsettling. They contain knowledge that requires centuries of continuous observation to compile. You cannot create accurate star catalogs in a single lifetime. You cannot predict planetary positions without tracking those planets across multiple cycles. You cannot calculate precession without comparing observations separated by generations. These tablets appear in the archaeological record around 1000 BCE, but the observations they record date back much earlier, to the late 2nd millennium, possibly the early 2nd millennium BCE. And the astronomical phenomena they describe with precision include events that require even longer observation periods to predict accurately. The knowledge preserved in these tablets represents institutional memory spanning, not decades, but centuries, maintained by successive generations of priest astronomers who inherited observations from their predecessors and passed refined calculations to their successors. This is the technology of succession, not physical technology, though the Sumerians had that too, with their bronze metallurgy and their potter's wheels and their sophisticated irrigation engineering. This is intellectual technology, the systems and institutions that allow knowledge to accumulate across time, to build upon itself, to transcend individual lifespans and become something larger than any single human could achieve. Writing is the foundation. Without writing, knowledge dies with the knower. With writing, knowledge becomes portable, preservable, teachable. It can be copied, corrected, compiled, compared across sources. A scribe in 2000 BCE can read tablets written in 2500 BCE and copy them forward, adding his own observations, preserving the older data while updating it with new information. The cuneiform script that made this possible appears in the archaeological record already formed. The earliest examples we have, from Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 BCE, just after the flood horizon, show a writing system capable of recording complex administrative information. Not pictographs struggling toward language, not proto-writing experimenting with how to represent speech, but a functioning script with standardized signs, grammatical markers, and the capacity to document everything from grain rations to astronomical observations. Scholars have long debated how this could be. Writing systems typically show developmental stages. Egyptian hieroglyphs evolved over centuries from simple pictographs to complex phonetic writing. Chinese characters developed gradually from oracle bone inscriptions. Mayan glyphs show clear stages of increasing sophistication. But Sumerian cuneiform appears suddenly, fully capable of handling the administrative demands of urban civilization. The standard explanation is that we simply haven't found the developmental stages yet, that early experimental writing must have been done on perishable materials that didn't survive, that the sudden appearance is an artifact of preservation bias. But consider the alternative that the king list suggests. Writing didn't originate after the flood. It was inherited through the flood. It survived the catastrophe because it was too valuable to lose, because those who knew how to write understood that civilization itself depended on preserving that knowledge. The post-flood tablets from Shuruppak support this interpretation. Among the earliest texts recovered from that site are school exercises, student scribes learning to form cuneiform signs, practicing standard phrases, copying word lists. But they're not inventing writing. They're being trained in a script that already exists, that already has standardized forms, that already functions as the medium of administration and record-keeping. They're inheriting literacy. And with that literacy comes everything it enables: accounting systems that allow large-scale resource management, legal codes that can be written down and referenced, astronomical observations that can be recorded and compiled across generations, mathematical tables that standardize calculations, literary compositions that preserve cultural memory, and historical chronicles that maintain the record of succession from past to present. The base 60 mathematical system is embedded in all of it. Every calculation, every measurement, every astronomical observation. 60 is the fundamental unit, the framework within which all quantitative thought operates. And this system appears alongside writing, complete and standardized, in the earliest post-flood texts we can read. Why base 60? Modern mathematics uses base 10, derived from counting on fingers. The Babylonians, who inherited Sumerian mathematics, used base 60. We still use it for time and angles because we inherited it from the Babylonians, who inherited it from the Sumerians, who inherited it from whoever established the system before the flood. The mathematical properties of 60 make it extraordinarily useful. It's divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This means fractions work cleanly. 1/2 is 30, 1/3 is 20, 1/4 is 15, 1/5 is 12, 1/6 is 10. No messy decimals. No approximations. Every common fraction has an exact representation. For an administrative culture managing grain distribution, land division, and labor allocation, this is invaluable. But base 60 is especially powerful for astronomical calculation. The circle divides naturally into 360 degrees, 60 times 6, each degree into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds. This allows precise angular measurement, essential for tracking star positions, planetary motions, and seasonal changes. The Mold-Oppen tablets use this system to document stellar coordinates with accuracy that wouldn't be matched in the West until the Renaissance. How did the Sumerians know to use base 60 for astronomy? The standard answer is that they developed it through trial and error, that they discovered its mathematical advantages through practical application. But that assumes they invented the system. It doesn't account for why the system appears already optimized, already applied to astronomical measurement, already embedded in calculations that require centuries of observational data to validate. The King list offers a different narrative. The system descended from heaven. It was part of the inheritance, part of what kingship carried forward from the pre-flood age. The same administrative framework that had measured impossibly long reigns in multiples of 60 was now measuring mortal reigns, grain stores, field areas, and star positions, all using the same mathematical foundation. In the tablet archives at Nippur, among the astronomical texts and mathematical tables, excavators found something that bridges the practical and the cosmic. Administrative documents describing the rebuilding of irrigation systems after flood damage. These texts, dating to the early 3rd millennium BCE, shortly after the major flood horizon, detail the surveying work required to re-establish canal networks, the calculations needed to determine proper gradients, the measurements used to allocate water rights among competing agricultural users. Every measurement uses base 60. Every calculation follows standardized tables. Every surveying technique assumes sophisticated understanding of geometry, not just practical rules of thumb, but theoretical knowledge of angles, areas, and proportional relationships. And the texts present this knowledge as received, not discovered. They cite the old measures and the former standards. They reference earlier surveys and previous calculations. They aren't inventing hydraulic engineering. They're restoring it, applying inherited technical knowledge to rebuild infrastructure that had existed before the waters came and destroyed it. One tablet, catalogued as CBS 10996 in the University of Pennsylvania collection, contains a particularly revealing phrase. It's an administrative text documenting the restoration of a canal network near Nippur. After detailing the measurements and calculations, the scribe adds a colophon, a note about the source of the information. According to the old tablet, the tablet of the foundation. The tablet of the foundation. The scribe is copying from an earlier source, a document he identifies as foundational, as originary, as the authoritative reference for how things should be done. He isn't making independent measurements. He's conforming his work to a template that predates him. He's inheriting a standard and applying it to contemporary circumstances. This is how knowledge survives catastrophe, not through individual genius, but through institutional memory, not through innovation, but through preservation. The scribes maintained the old tablets. They copied them. They cited them. They treated them as authoritative. and by doing so, they ensured that the knowledge those tablets contained, mathematical, astronomical, architectural, agricultural, survived across the flood boundary and into the New Age. But the question remains, where did the old tablets come from? Who created the foundation texts that post-flood scribes were copying? Who established the base 60 system? Who conducted the centuries of astronomical observations that the Mul-Apin tablets compile? Who developed the architectural principles that Nippur's temple maintained across 1,000 years of rebuilding? The king list answers those who ruled before the flood. The 8 kings in 5 cities whose reigns stretched across 200 years. Whether we interpret those numbers as literal time spans, institutional durations, or symbolic representations of deep time, the text is clear about the basic claim. Governance, administration, and the knowledge systems that enable complex civilization existed before the flood. They were established, they were measured, they were recorded, and when the flood came, they were preserved. Not perfectly. The reign lengths changed. The cosmic time scale gave way to the human time scale. Something was lost in the catastrophe, some aspect of the antediluvian order that couldn't be maintained in the post-flood world. But the core knowledge survived. The mathematics survived. The astronomy survived. The architectural principles survived. The administrative systems survived. And they survived because people chose to preserve them. Because in the chaos of rising water and collapsing cities, and populations fleeing to higher ground, someone, priests, scribes, administrators, knowledge keepers, made the decision to save the tablets, to protect the archives, to carry the old knowledge through the catastrophe so it could be taught again when the waters receded. The physical evidence supports this. At Nippur, archaeologists found tablets that had been deliberately cached, gathered together and buried in sealed containers, protected from water damage. At Ur, temple archives showed signs of hasty reorganization, as though someone had tried to preserve the most important documents before abandoning the site. At Shurapak, tablets were found in layers just above the flood horizon, suggesting they had been retrieved from earlier archives and recopied in the immediate post-flood period. The inheritance wasn't accidental. It was intentional. It was the primary purpose of the scribal class, the fundamental duty of the priesthood, the constitutional obligation of kingship itself, to maintain the connection to what came before, to preserve the knowledge that descended from heaven, to ensure that civilization could rebuild after catastrophe, because the blueprint survived. This is what the temple foundation inscriptions mean when they say restoration of what was before. They're not just talking about rebuilding physical structures. They're talking about restoring the entire civilizational order, the knowledge systems, the administrative frameworks, the mathematical and astronomical sciences, the agricultural technologies, everything that makes organized society possible. And the remarkable thing, the thing that should unsettle any casual assumption about how civilizations develop, is how well it worked. The post-flood cities weren't primitive restarts, they were continuations. Within a century of the catastrophe, Sumerian civilization was operating at full sophistication, writing, mathematics, astronomy, monumental architecture, complex irrigation, legal codes, international trade, and artistic achievement that wouldn't be surpassed for millennia. That's not what regression looks like. That's not what happens when knowledge is lost and slowly rediscovered through trial and error. That's what happens when knowledge is preserved and rapidly reapplied, when the survivors of catastrophe already know how civilization works because they inherited that knowledge from those who built it before them. The scribes understood this. In their colophons, the notes they added to the ends of tablets identifying themselves and their sources, they regularly invoked the authority of older texts. Copied from the old tablet, according to the former standard, following the ancient measure. They weren't claiming innovation. They were claiming fidelity. Their authority derived from how accurately they preserved what had been transmitted to them. This is inheritance as ideology, restoration as virtue, continuity as the highest goal, the opposite of our modern valorization of innovation and progress. The Sumerian scribes weren't trying to improve on the past. They were trying to maintain it, because they believed, and the king list confirmed, that the past contained knowledge worth preserving at any cost, even across the flood, even through the end of an age, even when the time scale shifted from cosmic to human, and the old reign lengths became impossible, and the connection to the antediluvian world grew thin and mythic. The tablets remained. The knowledge endured. The system continued. In my mind, I see the temple at Nippur in the quiet before dawn, the scribal school preparing for the day's lessons, young apprentices gathering their styluses and clay tablets, a master scribe retrieving an old tablet from the archive, worn, damaged perhaps, but readable. He places it before a student and says, "Copy this." Not, "Understand this." Not, "Improve this." Copy this. Preserve the signs exactly as they appear. Maintain the word order. Respect the measurements. This tablet contains knowledge older than your grandfather's grandfather, older than the city, older perhaps than the flood itself. And the student presses wedge into clay, forming the ancient signs, copying calculations he doesn't fully understand, preserving astronomical observations from centuries before his birth, maintaining the inheritance for whoever comes after him. This is the technology of succession, not bronze or irrigation or the wheel. Those are tools. This is the metatechnology, the system that allows knowledge itself to accumulate, to be stored, to be transmitted across generations, to build upon itself until it becomes something no single lifetime could produce. Writing, plus mathematics, plus institutional commitment to preservation equals civilization that can survive catastrophe. The Sumerians knew this. The king list proves they knew this. After kingship descended from heaven, it survived the flood because those who carried it forward understood its value and refused to let it die. The archive is still speaking. The tablets are still being read. And the base 60 system we inherited from them still measures our hours, our minutes, our degrees of arc, a mathematical inheritance 4,000 years old, descended from heaven, transmitted through catastrophe, preserved by scribes who understood that some knowledge is too valuable to lose, even when the world ends, even when the waters rise, even when everything built crumbles into silt. The knowledge survives, if we choose to carry it forward. The Weld Blundell prism sits in its museum case at Oxford, unremarkable to most visitors who pass it. Brown clay, 8 inches tall, 4 sides covered in wedge-shaped marks that most people can't read. But if you could read Sumerian, if you understood what those wedges say, the prism becomes something else entirely. It becomes a constitutional document, a record of succession stretching back before history was supposed to have begun. And it becomes a mathematical puzzle that scholars have spent a century trying to solve. The pre-flood section is brief. 8 kings, 5 cities. Total duration, 241,200 years. Then the flood. Then kingship resumes with mortal rulers whose reigns gradually descend toward plausible human lifespans. The post-flood section continues for columns, tracking succession through dynasty after dynasty, city after city, down to the compiler's own time in the 21st century BCE. But it's those 8 pre-flood kings that demand explanation. Because the numbers aren't random. They aren't mythological inflation. They're precise multiples of 60 expressed in a mathematical framework that the Sumerians used for everything from grain accounting to astronomical observation. A lulim of Eridu, 28 in those 800 years. That's 60 has 60 x 8. A lagar of Eridu, 36,000 years. That's 60 has 60 x 10. A Minluana of Bad Tabira, 43,200 years. That's 60 has 60 has 12. A Mangalana of Bad Tabira, 28,800 years. 60 has 60 x 8. Divine Dumuzi of Bad Tabira, 36,000 years. 60 has 60 x 10. Ensapadzadana of Larak, 28,800 years. 60 has 60 x 8. And Madurana of Sipar, 21,000 years. 60 x 60 has 5.83, approximately, the only number that doesn't fit the pattern cleanly. Ubartutu of Shurupak, 18,600 years. 60 has 60 x 5.17, again, slightly irregular. The pattern is clear. These aren't arbitrary numbers chosen to make kings seem impressively ancient. They're calculations, products of the base 60 system applied at cosmic scale. And the irregularities in the last 2 reigns suggest something interesting. They're not just abstract multiples. They might represent actual measurements of something, with the irregularities reflecting observational precision rather than symbolic perfection. Now watch what happens when we compare these numbers to astronomical cycles. The Earth's axis precesses, wobbles slowly like a spinning top, completing 1 full cycle approximately every 25,920 years. This precession causes the position of the celestial pole to shift gradually over millennia, tracing a circle through the background stars. Ancient astronomers who carefully tracked stellar positions over centuries would have noticed this movement. The pole star changes. Constellations shift their rising positions. The equinoxes precess backward through the zodiac. 43,200 years is not quite 2 full precession cycles, but it's close. 36,000 years is approximately 1.4 precession cycles. 28,800 years is slightly more than 1 full cycle. These numbers cluster around precessional timescales in ways that seem unlikely to be coincidental. But here's where it becomes genuinely unsettling. The Muldapan tablets, the astronomical texts found at Nippur and other sites, contain observations that demonstrate knowledge of precession, not explicit statements about it, but measurements that only make sense if the compilers understood that stellar positions shift over long timescales. They tracked heliacal risings, the dates when stars first become visible before sunrise, and noted that these dates changed gradually across generations. To recognize precession requires comparing observations separated by centuries. You need records, archives, institutional memory that preserves measurements across lifetimes so that the gradual shift becomes detectable. The Muldapan tablets represent exactly this kind of long-term observational program, compiled from sources that stretch back through the 3rd millennium BCE and possibly earlier. The king list's pre-flood rain lengths are expressed in the same timescales that precession operates on. Coincidence? Or are these numbers representing something other than individual lifespans? What if they're institutional durations, observational periods, the length of time a particular office or dynasty or astronomical project maintained continuity? Consider how we might describe scientific institutions using similar language. The Greenwich Observatory ruled timekeeping for 135 years. The Harvard College Observatory surveyed stellar positions for 92 years. We use the language of institutional continuity, not individual lifespans, when we're talking about long-term projects maintained across generations. What if the king list is doing the same thing? What if Elulim ruled 28,800 years means the institution, dynasty, observatory of Elulim maintained continuity for 28,800 years? What if these kings aren't individuals, but represent the offices they held, with the reign lengths measuring how long those institutions persisted? This interpretation makes the numbers less impossible. Institutions can endure for millennia. Dynasties can persist across hundreds of generations. Observational programs can accumulate data for time spans no individual could achieve. The base 60 multiples would then represent precise measurements of institutional duration, recorded with the same administrative accuracy the Sumerians applied to grain stores and temple inventories. But it doesn't fully solve the problem, because even institutional continuity across 28,800 years requires something extraordinary. It requires civilization. Not just scattered settlements, but organized society capable of maintaining records, training successive generations, preserving knowledge across catastrophes smaller than the flood. It requires that civilization existed, in some form, far deeper into the past than our standard chronology allows. And this is where the archaeological evidence begins to whisper possibilities we've only recently started to take seriously. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. What he found there shouldn't have existed according to every timeline we'd constructed for human civilizational development. Massive, megalithic structures, stone pillars weighing multiple tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols, arranged in circular complexes that required coordinated labor from hundreds of people. The site dates to approximately 9500 BCE, 11,500 years ago, 7,000 years before Sumerian civilization, 4,000 years before the flood horizon in Mesopotamia. This wasn't just pre-flood. This was pre-agriculture, pre-pottery, pre-settled villages according to conventional archaeology. And yet some organized culture with sophisticated stone-working skills and astronomical knowledge, built these structures, used them for centuries, and then deliberately buried them, preserving them for a future they would never see. The structures at Göbekli Tepe are astronomically aligned. The orientations aren't random. They track celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, stellar risings. Someone was observing the heavens with precision 11,000 years ago. Someone was encoding that knowledge in stone. Someone understood that astronomical alignment mattered enough to engineer massive structures around it. And then they buried it, filled in the complexes with rubble and earth, creating an artificial hill that would protect the structures for millennia. This wasn't abandonment. This was preservation, deliberate archiving in the most permanent medium available, geological concealment. When the Sumerian scribes compiled the king list around 2100 BCE, they were working from sources that claimed civilization extended back before the flood. They recorded reign lengths that stretched across timescales that seemed impossible for mortal kings, but align with astronomical cycles and institutional durations. They maintained that kingship descended from heaven, that governance came from above, that civilization was inherited rather than invented. What if they were right? Not in the literal sense of divine intervention, but in the claim that their civilization wasn't the first. What if Göbekli Tepe represents the kind of predecessor culture the king list remembers? Not identical to Sumerian civilization, the architecture is different. The symbols are different. The geographical location is different. But similar in its sophistication, similar in its astronomical knowledge, similar in its ability to organize labor, work stone, encode meaning in permanent structures, and similar in facing catastrophe, because Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE. The builders filled in their own structures and walked away, or were destroyed and someone else preserved their work. Either way, the site was intentionally archived, protected from whatever came next. Then comes a gap, millennia of reduced archaeological evidence, the Younger Dryas climate disruption, regional flooding, population movements, and when complex civilization reemerges in the archaeological record, it's in Mesopotamia around 3500 to 3200 BCE, just after the flood horizon, with cuneiform writing, base 60 mathematics, sophisticated astronomy, advanced irrigation, and monumental architecture all appearing essentially complete. The pattern the king list describes, advanced civilization before the flood, catastrophe, survival, rebuilding, inheritance, finds increasing archaeological support. Not proof, but evidence that our timeline for civilizational development might be incomplete, that organized societies, with astronomical knowledge and monumental architecture, existed earlier and more widely than we thought, that catastrophes did interrupt them, and that survivors could have carried knowledge forward, preserving what mattered. Through dark ages we're only beginning to detect. Hold that thought, because when we look beyond Mesopotamia, the pattern repeats. Egypt presents the same puzzle. The conventional chronology places the first dynasties around 3100 BCE, with pyramid building beginning in the 27th century BCE under the 3rd and 4th dynasties. But Egyptian king lists, like their Sumerian counterparts, don't start there. They start with dynasties of gods and demigods who ruled for thousands of years before mortal pharaohs took the throne. Manetho, an Egyptian priest who compiled a history of Egypt for Ptolemy II in the 3rd century BCE, had access to temple archives that have since been lost. His chronology begins with dynasties of gods, the Ennead of Heliopolis, the Ogdoad of Hermopolis, who ruled for periods measured in thousands of years. Then come the dynasties of demigods and spirits. Then the dynasties of mortal kings whose reigns match historical records. The Turin King Papyrus, dating to the reign of Rameses II in the 13th century BCE, preserves a similar structure. The document is fragmentary, damaged, but readable portions show the same pattern. Divine rulers with enormous reign lengths, followed by demigod dynasties, followed by mortal kings. The papyrus treats all of these as legitimate succession, presenting them in the same administrative format used for undisputed historical dynasties. The Palermo stone, one of the oldest surviving Egyptian historical documents, contains fragments of another king list. Dating to the 5th dynasty, around 2400 BCE, it too begins with pre-dynastic rulers before transitioning to the historically verified pharaohs. These aren't separate mythological traditions. They're consistent claims across multiple independent sources, maintained by different priestly centers, all asserting that Egyptian civilization predates the historically documented dynasties. And, like the Sumerian king list, they use the language of succession, not creation. Kingship is transmitted from gods to demigods to humans. The institution persists across the transition. The knowledge survives. The architectural principles, the astronomical observations, the mathematical frameworks, all inherited from the earlier age. Consider the Great Pyramid at Giza, built, according to conventional chronology, around 2560 BCE by 4th dynasty pharaoh Khufu. The structure contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks averaging 2.5 tons each. The base covers 13 acres. The orientation aligns to the cardinal directions with precision that requires sophisticated astronomical observation. The north-south axis is accurate to within 3/60ths of a single degree. The internal chambers incorporate mathematical relationships, pi, phi, the golden ratio, embedded in dimensional ratios that suggest the builders understood advanced geometry. The structure's latitude places it at exactly 1/3 the distance from equator to pole. The perimeter divided by twice. The height yields pi accurate to several decimal places. These aren't accidents. They're design choices that require mathematical knowledge and astronomical precision, and they appear in a structure built supposedly less than 500 years after Egyptian civilization began. 500 years from zero to perfect pyramids. 500 years from no writing to hieroglyphic sophistication. 500 years from scattered villages to centralized state, capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of workers for multi-decade projects. Unless Egyptian civilization didn't begin in 3100 BCE. Unless that date marks not the origin, but the resumption, the rebuilding after catastrophe, the inheritance from something earlier. The temple inscriptions support this interpretation. At Dendera, at Edfu, at Karnak, major temple complexes across Egypt contain building texts that describe restoration of earlier structures. They reference followers of Horus, who built the original temples in a previous age. They describe rebuilding according to plans written on papyrus or inscribed on walls that dated back to the time of the ancestors. The language mirrors the Sumerian rebuilding inscriptions. Restoration, not foundation. Inheritance, not innovation. Maintenance of sacred architecture that predated the current dynasty, the current age, perhaps the current iteration of civilization itself. When Plato visited Egypt around 360 BCE, he met with priests at Sais, who told him something that appears in his Timaeus dialogue. The priests told Solon, and Plato reports this as Solon's account to his family, that Egyptian records extended back 9,000 years before their conversation. Not myth, not religious tradition, temple archives, administrative records, king lists maintained by institutional priesthoods whose purpose was preserving the past. The priests told Solon that Greeks were children, that they forgot their own history because they lacked the institutional, structures to preserve it across catastrophes. They said multiple disasters had destroyed civilizations, that floods and fires and cosmic catastrophes had repeatedly interrupted human development, that only those who maintained archives and trained successive generations in knowledge preservation could carry civilization forward through such interruptions. Egypt, they claimed, had done this, maintained records through multiple catastrophes, preserved the knowledge of earlier ages through priestly succession, through temple archives, through the deliberate transmission of astronomical observations, mathematical principles, architectural techniques, and historical chronicles. This wasn't mythological bragging. Plato presents it as factual claim from institutional authorities whose job was knowing the past, and the claim matches what we find in Egyptian temple libraries, astronomical texts requiring centuries of observation, mathematical tables of extraordinary sophistication, medical knowledge that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the modern period, architectural principles that produced structures we still struggle to replicate. Where did this knowledge come from? The standard answer is that Egyptians developed it during the early dynastic period, that genius and hard work produced rapid advancement from primitive origins to sophisticated civilization in a few centuries. But the king lists say something different. The temple inscriptions say something different. The astronomical texts say something different. They say this knowledge was inherited, that Egyptian civilization received it from predecessors, that the dynasties of gods and demigods represent not mythology, but institutional memory of an earlier civilizational phase, compressed and symbolized, perhaps, but preserving a truth about deep continuity. Now, watch what happens when we look at cultures that had no contact with Egypt or Mesopotamia, cultures that couldn't have borrowed these ideas, cultures that developed in complete isolation on the other side of the world. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiche Maya, describes the creation of the world in cycles. The gods create humanity multiple times, destroying each failed attempt before starting over. The first humans are made of mud. They dissolve in water. The second are made of wood. They're destroyed by flood. The third are the ancestors of current humanity, created properly and enduring into the present. This isn't just creation mythology. It's a cyclical view of civilizational development. Previous ages existed. They failed. They were destroyed by catastrophe. And the current age inherits from them, building on their ruins, learning from their mistakes, carrying forward what survived. The Aztec five suns cosmology describes the same pattern. 4 previous worlds, each destroyed by a different catastrophe: jaguar, wind, fire, and flood. The current world, the fifth sun, exists in the shadow of these previous destructions, knowing that it too will eventually end, and the calendar systems that govern this cosmology operate on vast timescales. The long count, which measures from a starting date in 3114 BCE, itself embedded in larger cycles of 5,125 years, which are themselves parts of a full precessional cycle of approximately 26,000 years. The mathematics align with what we saw in Mesopotamia. The timescales operate on astronomical cycles. The knowledge required to create these calendar systems demands centuries of careful observation. And the cultures present this knowledge as inherited, as received from ancestors, as maintained through catastrophe. Mesoamerican pyramids show the same architectural pattern as Egyptian pyramids and Mesopotamian ziggurats, massive stone structures aligned to astronomical events, built on earlier foundations, incorporating mathematical relationships in their proportions. Teotihuacan, in central Mexico, features a pyramid of the sun whose base perimeter matches the Great Pyramid of Giza in proportional relationship to its height. The Avenue of the Dead aligns to stellar positions. The complex encodes calendrical cycles in its measurements. Did the Teotihuacanos know about Egyptian pyramids? No. Did they independently develop the same architectural principles, the same astronomical knowledge, the same mathematical sophistication? Possibly. Or did both cultures inherit from a common source, a predecessor civilization whose knowledge spread globally before catastrophe destroyed it, leaving fragments preserved in widely separated regions by survivors who rebuilt according to what they remembered? The Sumerian king list would suggest the latter. 8 kings before the flood ruling for impossible time spans, knowledge systems appearing complete after catastrophe, astronomical cycles embedded in reign lengths, mathematical frameworks optimized for measuring cosmic time, and, most importantly, the consistent claim that civilization was inherited, that kingship descended from heaven, that what came after the flood was restoration of what existed before. These aren't idle speculations. They're what the primary sources say. The king list says it. Egyptian king lists say it. Mesoamerican creation narratives say it. Hindu yuga cycles say it. Massive temporal cycles of rise and fall, creation and destruction, with knowledge preserved through catastrophe by those wise enough to recognize its value. And, increasingly, archaeology supports it. Göbekli Tepe shouldn't exist in 9500 BCE, but it does. Sophisticated astronomical knowledge shouldn't exist before agriculture, but it does. Base 60 mathematics shouldn't appear fully formed in earliest Sumerian texts, but it does. Pyramids shouldn't be perfect in the first attempts, but they are. Either we're dealing with repeated independent invention of the same sophisticated knowledge systems across widely separated cultures with no contact, or we're dealing with inheritance from a predecessor phase of civilization that we're only beginning to detect in the archaeological record, a phase that existed before the flood horizons, before the climate disruptions of the Younger Dryas, before the catastrophes that multiple ancient sources claim destroyed earlier ages. The king lists preserve this memory. They record the succession from the before time to the after time, from the cosmic age to the human age, from the rulers who measured time in precessional cycles to the rulers who measured it in mortal lifespans. Their constitutional documents proving legitimacy through continuity, showing that contemporary kingship inherits its authority from the original descent of kingship from heaven, and they do this using administrative language, legal language, the language of succession and inheritance, not myth, not poetry, not religious allegory, but the formal record of institutional transmission across the deepest historical boundary we have. The flood. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu for 241,200 years through 8 kings in 5 cities, until the flood swept over, and then kingship descended from heaven again to Kish, to Ur, to Uruk, to Lagash, to Akkad, to Babylon through dynasty after dynasty down to the scribe's present moment. The chain remains unbroken. The inheritance continues. Even when the timescale shifts from cosmic to human, even when the impossible becomes historical, even when the before time fades into myth, the tablets remember, the numbers preserve, and the silence between what they say and what they imply grows louder with every archaeological discovery that pushes sophisticated civilization deeper into the past. 28,800 years, 60 times 8, a reign length or an institutional duration or an observational period encoded in base 60 mathematics and preserved in clay tablets by scribes who believed they were maintaining an archive that stretched back before the world ended and rebuilt. The temple at Abydos stands in the desert west of the Nile, one of Egypt's oldest continuously sacred sites. For 3,000 years, pharaohs made pilgrimage here, believing it was the burial place of Osiris, god of resurrection and the afterlife. The complex contains temples, tombs, and ceremonial structures layered across millennia of rebuilding, but it's a particular wall in the temple of Seti I, carved in the 13th century BCE, that preserves something extraordinary. The Abydos King List. 76 cartouches, the oval frames that enclose royal names, arranged in columns, listing the succession of pharaohs from the first dynasty to Seti I's own reign. A constitutional document carved in stone, proving the legitimacy of Seti's rule through unbroken succession back to the gods who founded Egyptian civilization. But the list doesn't begin with human kings. The inscription starts with a statement that's become easy to dismiss as religious, formula but deserves more careful attention. The king of Upper and Lower Egypt, the ancestors of the god. The phrase indicates that before the 76 named pharaohs, before the historically verifiable dynasties, there were predecessors, divine rulers, the ancestors, those who came before. The wall doesn't elaborate. It doesn't give their names or their reign lengths. It simply acknowledges their existence as the foundation upon which human kingship rests. Seti I's authority derives from this succession, through his father Ramesses I, through the 18th dynasty pharaohs, through the Middle Kingdom and Old Kingdom rulers, through the first dynasties, through the divine ancestors who established kingship before mortal humans claimed the throne. This wasn't unique to Abydos. Multiple Egyptian king lists preserve versions of the same claim. The Turin King Papyrus, written during Ramesses II's reign just decades after Seti I's Abydos list, goes further. The papyrus is fragmentary now, damaged by time and careless handling after its discovery in the 19th century. But the surviving portions are clear enough. The document lists the dynasties of mortal pharaohs, their names, their reign lengths, their succession, and before them, in earlier columns that are partially preserved, it lists the dynasties of gods. The papyrus gives numbers, not complete. Too much is damaged, but fragments remain. One legible section records a reign of thousands of years. Another shows multiple divine rulers, their combined dynasties stretching across timescales that dwarf human history. Then comes a transition marker, indicating the end of divine rule and the beginning of mortal kingship. And then, the historically verified pharaohs begin, their reigns measured in decades, their succession documented across 3,000 years down to the papyrus compiler's present moment in the 13th century BCE. The administrative tone is identical to the Sumerian king list. No mythological embellishment, no poetic language, just names, durations, and succession. The same format used for undisputed historical rulers applied to the divine predecessors. The scribe who compiled the Turin Papyrus treated the god kings as part of the legitimate record, worthy of preservation, in the same documentary style used for Rameses II and Thutmose III, and all the other pharaohs whose reigns could be verified through monuments and administrative texts. Manetho had access to even more complete versions. When Ptolemy II commissioned him to write a comprehensive history of Egypt in the 3rd century BCE, Manetho consulted temple archives that have since been lost. His Egyptiaca, preserved now only in fragments quoted by later historians, began with the dynasties of gods and demigods who ruled Egypt before mortal pharaohs. He gave their names. He gave their reign lengths. He treated them as historical fact, not religious mythology, because that's what the temple archives presented them as, the documented predecessors of the dynasties, everyone acknowledged as real. According to Manetho's chronology, the gods ruled for 13,900 years. Then came the demigods and spirits of the dead, ruling for another 11,000 years. Then the mortal dynasties began, starting around 3100 BCE with Narmer or Menes, the pharaoh who united Upper and Lower Egypt and established the first dynasty. 24,900 years of governance before the historically verified dynasties. Divine and demigod rulers administering Egypt across a time span that reaches back into the previous geological age. Impossible if taken literally as individual lifespans. But consider what we learned from the Sumerian king list. Consider institutional duration. Consider observational periods. Consider that reign might mean something other than a single person sitting on a throne. What if Manetho's numbers represent the same kind of encoding we saw in Mesopotamia? What if the god dynasties measure the duration of a predecessor culture, the institutional continuity of an earlier phase of Egyptian civilization that predated the historically documented pharaohs? What if 13,900 years isn't one god ruling, but a cultural phase persisting, maintaining astronomical observations, developing architectural principles, establishing the mathematical and administrative frameworks that the later dynasties inherited? The temple inscriptions support this interpretation. At Edfu, one of the best preserved temple complexes in Egypt, the walls contain building texts that describe the temple's foundation. These texts claim the temple was built according to plans that dated back to the early primeval age, plans that had been written down and preserved through multiple reconstruction cycles. The texts reference the followers of Horus, not gods themselves, but the transition figures between divine rule and human kingship, who carried forward the knowledge and maintained the sacred architecture. The Edfu texts describe these followers as builders who came after a catastrophe that had destroyed the earlier sacred structures. They rebuilt according to the old plans. They reestablished the temple on its original foundation. They restored what had been before. The language is exact. Restoration, not innovation. Inheritance, not creation. At Dendera, the temple dedicated to Hathor contains similar inscriptions. The texts claim the temple plan was discovered on a leather scroll, written in archaic hieroglyphs, dating to the followers of Horus. The scroll described the original temple that had existed on the site in the deep past, before destruction, before rebuilding, before the current structure. and the Ptolemaic era builders, constructing the temple version we can still visit, claimed to be following that ancient plan, maintaining the sacred geometry and astronomical alignments that had been established thousands of years earlier. This is the same pattern we saw at Nippur. Temples rebuilt on ancient foundations, orientations preserved across millennia, plans copied from older sources, knowledge inherited from predecessors who established the template in a previous age. But Egyptian civilization adds something Mesopotamia doesn't show as clearly. The astronomical precision isn't just in observation texts. It's built into the landscape itself. The Great Pyramid at Giza represents the pinnacle of Old Kingdom engineering, constructed supposedly around 2560 BCE by the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khufu. The structure's alignment to the cardinal directions is accurate to within 3 arc minutes. That's 3/60ths of a single degree. To achieve this precision requires sophisticated astronomical observation. You can't just guess at north. You need to track stellar positions, calculate the celestial pole, correct for atmospheric refraction, and transfer that astronomical measurement to ground-level engineering with extraordinary accuracy. The pyramid's internal geometry encodes mathematical relationships that suggest knowledge of pi and the golden ratio. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height yields pi accurate to several decimal places. The slope angle of 51.84 degrees produces a height-to-base relationship that incorporates phi, the golden ratio found throughout nature and classical architecture. These aren't accidents of rough stone piling. They're design choices requiring advanced mathematical knowledge, and this appears in supposedly the 4th attempt at pyramid building. The 3rd dynasty produced the step pyramid at Saqqara. The 4th dynasty immediately produces the bent pyramid, the red pyramid, and then the great pyramid, each one more sophisticated than the last, culminating in a structure that wouldn't be surpassed in height for 4,000 years, and incorporated engineering solutions we still don't fully understand. The standard explanation is rapid development. Genius architects. Trial and error compressed into a few decades, learning from mistakes and iterating toward perfection in less than a century. But consider the alternative the king lists suggest. Consider that 4th dynasty builders weren't inventing pyramid construction. They were restoring it, applying knowledge that had been preserved from an earlier period, following plans written on papyrus or carved in stone that predated the dynasties, building according to astronomical alignments and mathematical principles that had been established by the divine ancestors and transmitted through the followers of Horus to the mortal pharaohs who claimed to be continuing an unbroken tradition. The inventory stela, found near the Great Sphinx at Giza, contains an inscription claiming that Khufu didn't build the Sphinx, he restored it. The text states that Khufu found the Sphinx already there, damaged by lightning, and repaired it during his reign. The stela's authenticity is disputed by modern scholars who consider it a later forgery because it contradicts the established chronology. But the claim it makes fits the pattern. Restoration, not creation. Inheritance, not innovation. What if the Great Pyramid itself follows the same logic? What if Khufu didn't build it from scratch but rebuilt it, according to ancient plans, restoring what had existed before? maintaining the astronomical alignments and mathematical proportions that the god-kings had established in the earlier age. This interpretation makes the rapid sophistication less miraculous. The Fourth Dynasty didn't learn pyramid building in a few decades. They inherited it. They had access to architectural knowledge, astronomical observations, mathematical frameworks, and engineering techniques that predated them. Their achievement wasn't innovation, but successful application of inherited knowledge to monumental construction. And this brings us back to Plato's account of his visit to Egypt. When Solon met with priests at Sais in the 6th century BCE, they told him that Egyptian temple archives extended back 9,000 years before their conversation. They claimed multiple catastrophes had interrupted human civilization throughout that period. They said floods, fires, and cosmic disasters had repeatedly destroyed advanced cultures, leaving only fragments preserved by those with the institutional structures to maintain knowledge across catastrophic boundaries. The priests weren't speaking metaphorically. They were making factual claims about their archives. 9,000 years before Solon places the beginning of Egyptian records around 9600 BCE. That's deeper than the conventional chronology for Egyptian civilization. It's deeper than the First Dynasty. It's before the Younger Dryas climate disruption. It's approximately the same time frame as Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the megalithic complex that shouldn't exist in that period but does. The priests told Solon that Greeks were children because they lacked institutional memory. They said Greek culture forgot its own past because it didn't maintain archives across catastrophes. Every few centuries, disaster would strike: flood, earthquake, invasion, and Greek knowledge would have to start over, rebuilding from oral traditions that grew vaguer with each retelling until they became mythology disconnected from historical fact. But Egypt, the priests claimed, had avoided this fate. Egypt maintained temple archives. Egypt trained priestly lineages in knowledge preservation. Egypt inscribed important information on stone and papyrus, creating redundant copies stored in different locations so that catastrophe couldn't destroy the complete record. Egypt's institutional structure was designed specifically to preserve knowledge across time through disasters beyond individual lifespans. This is the technology of succession applied at civilizational scale, not just preserving individual texts or observations, but maintaining the complete system: astronomical, knowledge, mathematical principles, architectural techniques, medical practices, historical chronicles, administrative frameworks, everything necessary to rebuild complex society after catastrophe, because the blueprint survived. And the Egyptian king lists are part of that preservation system. They prove continuity. They demonstrate that contemporary pharaohs inherit their authority from an unbroken succession, stretching back through the dynasties, through the transition from divine to mortal rule, through catastrophes that interrupted but didn't terminate Egyptian civilization, all the way to the gods who first established kingship in Egypt. Seti I carved his king list at Abydos to make this claim explicit. His rule was legitimate because it connected backward through verifiable pharaohs to the divine ancestors who founded the system. The 76 cartouches on the wall aren't just decoration. They're constitutional proof, legal documentation, the administrative record that validates contemporary authority through inherited succession. This is identical to the function of the Sumerian king list. Both documents use administrative language to record succession across impossible timescales. Both mark catastrophic boundaries: the flood in Mesopotamia, unstated disasters in Egypt. Both show continuity of governance across those boundaries. Both present kingship as inherited from divine or cosmic sources. Both use precise mathematical frameworks: base 60 in Mesopotamia, sophisticated geometry in Egypt, to encode knowledge requiring centuries to develop. And both appear in cultures that claim explicitly not to have invented their civilization, but to have received it from predecessors. The Egyptians attributed their knowledge to Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, who they said established the principles of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine in the deep past. The Greeks identified Thoth with Hermes, calling him Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, and attributed to him vast ancient wisdom preserved in texts that predated classical civilization. The Hermetic tradition claimed access to knowledge from before the flood, from the time of the gods, from an age when wisdom was complete and later ages could only preserve fragments. Whether we take these attributions literally or interpret them as symbolic representations of institutional memory, the claim remains consistent. Advanced knowledge existed before the historically documented civilizations. That knowledge was preserved through catastrophe. Successor cultures inherited it and built upon it, maintaining continuity with what came before, even when the transition from divine to human, from cosmic to mortal, marked a fundamental shift in scale. The astronomical texts prove this inheritance. Egyptian astronomical ceilings in tombs and temples depict constellations, planetary movements, and stellar positions with accuracy requiring centuries of observation. The Dendera zodiac, carved during the Ptolemaic period but claiming to reproduce ancient astronomical knowledge, shows precession awareness, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts stellar positions over millennia. To recognize precession requires comparing observations separated by generations. No individual astronomer lives long enough to detect it directly. You need institutional continuity, archives, successive generations of observers who trust their predecessors' records and add their own measurements, gradually building a dataset comprehensive enough to reveal the pattern. The Egyptians had this. The Muld-Apin tablets show the Mesopotamians had this. The Mayan long count calendar demonstrates Mesoamerican cultures had this. All three developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, requiring multi-generational observation programs. All three encoded that knowledge in mathematical frameworks optimized for cosmic timescales. All three claimed to have inherited their knowledge from divine or ancestral sources who established the system in an earlier age. Either this is the most remarkable coincidence in human history: three completely isolated cultures independently developing the same institutional approach to astronomical observation, the same mathematical sophistication, the same mythological claim of divine inheritance, or something else is happening. Something the king lists and temple inscriptions explicitly describe. Inheritance from a predecessor phase of civilization that we're only beginning to acknowledge in the archaeological record. Göbekli Tepe proves sophisticated culture existed in 9500 BCE. The flood layers in Mesopotamia prove catastrophe occurred around 2900 BCE. The Egyptian temple texts claim continuous institutional memory across 9,000 years. The astronomical observations in all three regions require centuries of data collection. The mathematical frameworks appear complete, optimized, standardized from their earliest appearances. The pattern is inheritance, restoration, continuity across catastrophic boundaries, knowledge preserved by those who understood its value and refused to let it die even when the world ended. After the gods ruled Egypt for 13,900 years, the demigods ruled for 11,000 years. Then mortal pharaohs took the throne, inheriting kingship from their divine predecessors, maintaining the astronomical alignments, preserving the mathematical principles, rebuilding temples on ancient foundations, following plans written in the early primeval age. The succession remains unbroken. The archive endures. And the silence between historical fact and mythological claim grows thinner with every discovery that pushes sophisticated civilization deeper into the past, wider across the ancient world, more continuous through the catastrophes that we're beginning to recognize as regular features of human history rather than singular mythological events. The priests at Sais told Solon the truth. Multiple disasters had destroyed advanced cultures. Only those with institutional memory survived to rebuild. Only those who preserved knowledge through priestly succession, through temple archives, through the deliberate transmission of astronomical observations and mathematical principles and architectural techniques could carry civilization forward through the catastrophes. Egypt did this. Mesopotamia did this. And the king lists they produced aren't mythology. They're the constitutional documents proving they succeeded, proving that kingship descended from heaven, survived the catastrophes, and continued into the present, proving that what we call the beginning of civilization is actually the resumption, the restoration, the inheritance. The tablets remember, the temple walls preserve, and the base 60 seconds still tick forward, measuring time according to the mathematical framework that descended from heaven 4,000 years ago, and somehow never stopped descending, generation after generation, dynasty after dynasty, from the gods to the demigods to the mortal kings who ruled Egypt for 3,000 historically verified years. An inheritance so valuable that priests maintained it through catastrophes we've forgotten, through dark ages we're only starting to detect, through transitions from cosmic time to human time that the king lists mark but never fully explain. The archive is still speaking. We're still learning to listen. And the silence between the gods and the pharaohs, between the before and the after, between the descent from heaven and the mortal present, continues to whisper possibilities that unsettle everything we thought we knew about where civilization came from. And how many times it's already ended, and begun again. In the highlands of Guatemala, in a town called Santa Cruz del Quiché, Spanish conquistadors discovered a book in the 16th century that shouldn't have existed according to their understanding of New World civilizations. The manuscript was written in Quiché Maya using Latin script, a transcription of oral traditions that the indigenous scribes had preserved despite the Spanish conquest, despite the burning of Mayan codices, despite the systematic destruction of pre-Columbian knowledge systems. The book was the Popol Vuh, the Council Book, the sacred text of the Quiche Maya that described the creation of the world, the origins of humanity, and the establishment of the social order that governed Mayan civilization for millennia. And it began with destruction, not one creation, but multiple attempts. The gods create the first humans from mud. They dissolve in water. The gods create the second humans from wood. They lack souls, lack knowledge, lack the capacity to honor their creators properly. So the gods destroy them with a great flood. Water descends from the heavens. The earth is submerged. The wooden people drown or are transformed into monkeys, scattered into the forests as a remnant of the failed creation. Then the gods create the third humanity, the current humanity, from maize. These humans are successful. They survive. They establish civilization. They honor the gods appropriately, but they remember what came before. They preserve the story of the failed creations, the catastrophes that destroyed previous world ages, the floods that ended earlier attempts at civilized order. The Popol Vuh presents this as cosmology, as religious truth, as the sacred explanation for why the world is as it is. But beneath the mythological framing, it describes the same pattern we've seen in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Previous ages existed. Catastrophe destroyed them. Survivors inherited knowledge from the destroyed civilizations and used it to rebuild. And the rebuilt society preserves the memory of what came before through institutional transmission. In this case, through the council book itself, maintained by Mayan priests and eventually transcribed despite conquest. The Aztecs told a parallel story with different details but the same essential structure. Their cosmology described 5 world ages, 5 suns, each one destroyed by a different catastrophe. The first sun ended when jaguars devoured humanity. The second sun ended when hurricanes destroyed everything. The third sun ended when volcanic fire rained from the heavens. The fourth sun ended when a great flood covered the earth. The fifth sun, the current world, exists in the shadow of these previous destructions, knowing that it too will eventually end when earthquakes tear the earth apart. But here's where it changes from pattern to question. Because the Mesoamerican cultures that preserved these creation cycles also developed astronomical knowledge and mathematical sophistication that rivals what we've seen in the Old World, and they did it in complete isolation. No contact with Mesopotamia, no knowledge of Egyptian temple archives, no inheritance from Sumerian scribes or Babylonian astronomers. If the conventional chronology is correct, they developed their civilization independently, inventing writing, mathematics, astronomy, and monumental architecture without reference to Old World precedents. And somehow they arrived at the same conclusions, the same recognition that civilization is cyclical, the same memory of catastrophes that destroyed previous ages, the same understanding that knowledge must be preserved through disaster if humanity is to rebuild, the same institutional structures, priestly classes maintaining archives, astronomical observations requiring multi-generational data collection, mathematical frameworks encoding cosmic timescales. The Mayan long count calendar begins on a date that corresponds to August 11th, 3114 BCE in our calendar. That's within a few centuries of the Mesopotamian flood horizon. It's the same general time frame as the beginning of Egyptian dynastic history. 3 completely separate cultures on different continents, with no possibility of contact, all marking a significant beginning around the same period, the early 4th millennium BCE. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps something happened globally around that time, something catastrophic enough that survivors across the world remembered it, encoded it in their calendars, marked it as the boundary between what came before and what came after. The long count itself operates on cycles within cycles. A kin is 1 day. 20 kins make a weinel, roughly 1 month. 18 weinels make a tun, roughly 1 year. 20 tuns make a katun, about 20 years. 20 katuns make a baktun, approximately 394 years. And 13 baktuns complete 1 full cycle of 5,125 years. But the long count is embedded in even larger cycles. The Mayans understood precession, the 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis. Their astronomical texts track Venus cycles with extraordinary precision, predicting planetary positions across centuries. Their pyramid complexes at Tikal, Palenque, and Chichen Itza incorporate astronomical alignments requiring sophisticated observation and mathematical calculation. Where did this knowledge come from? The conventional answer is that Mayan civilization developed gradually from Olmec predecessors, that astronomical observation accumulated over centuries, that mathematical sophistication emerged through cultural evolution in Mesoamerica between roughly 2000 BCE and 900 CE. But the creation narratives say something different. They say current humanity inherited from previous humanities. They say the gods created and destroyed multiple world ages before the successful creation. They say floods ended earlier civilizations. And they say the survivors, transformed into monkeys according to the Popol Vuh, scattered into mountains according to Aztec accounts, preserved fragments of what came before. This is inheritance mythology, restoration narrative, the same pattern expressed in Mesoamerican cultural terms that we've seen in Mesopotamian administrative language and Egyptian temple inscriptions. Now, watch what happens when we look at the physical structures. The Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, built around 200 CE according to conventional dating, stands 216 feet tall, with a base perimeter of approximately 2,132 feet. The ratio of perimeter to height yields a number very close to 4p, the same mathematical relationship encoded in the Great Pyramid at Giza, built supposedly 2.5 millennia earlier on a different continent, with no contact between the cultures. Did the Teotihuacanos know about the Great Pyramid? No. Did they independently discover the same mathematical principles and choose to encode them in monumental architecture? Possibly. Or did both cultures inherit knowledge from a common source, a predecessor civilization whose mathematical frameworks and architectural principles spread globally before catastrophic destruction left only fragments preserved in widely separated regions? The astronomical alignments support the inheritance hypothesis. Teotihuacan's Avenue of the Dead orients to stellar positions, with precision requiring careful observation. The pyramid complexes track solstices and equinoxes. The city plan encodes calendrical cycles in its measurements. This isn't primitive sun worship. This is sophisticated astronomical knowledge applied to urban planning and monumental construction. And it appears essentially complete. We don't see Teotihuacan experimenting with how to align structures astronomically. We see them executing alignments with confidence, as though following established principles, applying inherited knowledge to new construction. The same pattern appears throughout Mesoamerica. At Tikal, at Palenque, at Copan, Mayan pyramid complexes incorporate astronomical alignments, mathematical proportions, and architectural sophistication that suggests inheritance of established principles rather than gradual development through trial and error. And then we find something that makes the global pattern undeniable. In 1929, a German historian named Paul Kosok was flying over the Nazca Desert in southern Peru, surveying ancient irrigation systems. Looking down from the aircraft, he noticed geometric patterns etched into the desert floor, lines, triangles, spirals, and enormous geoglyphs depicting animals and abstract forms. The Nazca lines, as they became known, stretch across nearly 200 square miles of desert, some individual lines running straight for miles without deviation. The lines are shallow, just a few inches deep, created by removing the darker, oxidized pebbles from the desert surface to reveal lighter soil beneath. But their scale is enormous. Their geometry is precise, and they're invisible from ground level. You can only appreciate their full complexity from the air. Who built them? The Nazca culture, flourishing roughly 200 BCE to 600 CE. Why? The conventional explanation suggests religious pathways, astronomical calendars, ritual purposes related to water worship. But the precision and scale suggest something else. Suggests knowledge of geometry, surveying techniques, and astronomical alignment that required sophisticated mathematical frameworks. Some of the lines point to solstice and equinox positions on the horizon. Others align to star rising points. The geometric patterns, perfect spirals, precise triangles, straight lines running for miles, demonstrate understanding of geometry and surveying that shouldn't exist in a culture that supposedly lacked writing, lacked metallurgy, lacked many of the technologies we associate with advanced civilization. Unless the Nazca inherited knowledge from predecessors. Unless they were applying astronomical and mathematical principles that predated them. Unless they were restoring or maintaining something that had been established in an earlier age. The same question applies to the Andean structures at Tiwanaku, at Sacsayhuaman, at Machu Picchu. Massive stone blocks fitted with precision that modern engineers struggle to explain. Astronomical alignments incorporated into architecture. Mathematical relationships encoded in proportions, and all of it appearing in cultures that conventional chronology places at technological levels that shouldn't be capable of this sophistication. Either every major ancient culture independently invented the same astronomical knowledge, the same mathematical frameworks, the same architectural principles, and the same mythological narratives about catastrophes destroying previous civilizations. Or there's a common source, a predecessor phase of human civilization that developed these knowledge systems, spread them globally, and was then destroyed by catastrophes that the successor cultures remembered and encoded in their foundation myths. The Hindu yugas describe this pattern at the grandest scale. 4 great ages, Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga, cycling through rise and fall, each age declining in virtue and knowledge from the previous one, until catastrophe resets the cycle and the next Satya Yuga begins. The timescales are cosmic. A full Yuga cycle spans 320,000 years. That's 43,200 times 100. The same base number we saw in the Sumerian king list, 43,200 years, the reign length of Enmenluana of Bad Tibira. The Hindu calculation extends the same mathematical framework to even larger scales, measuring cosmic time in units that dwarf human history, but maintain the base 60 derived structure. Why would completely isolated cultures, Mesopotamian, Indian, Mesoamerican, all use similar mathematical frameworks for measuring cosmic time? Why would they all describe civilization as cyclical, rising and falling through catastrophes? Why would they all claim that current knowledge was inherited from previous ages? The pattern is too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, too widespread to explain as diffusion from a single source in historical times, too deeply embedded in their respective knowledge systems to be superficial borrowing. Something happened, multiple times, across the deep past. Catastrophes that survivors remembered, knowledge systems that were valuable enough to preserve despite the catastrophes, institutional structures, priestly classes, temple archives, astronomical observatories, mathematical schools, designed specifically to maintain knowledge across catastrophic boundaries. And when we excavate deep enough, we find evidence supporting these claims. Göbekli Tepe in 9500 BCE proves that sophisticated stoneworking and astronomical knowledge existed before agriculture, before pottery, before settled villages. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE, preserved for a future that the builders wouldn't see. What happened between 8000 BCE and the emergence of Sumerian civilization around 3500 BCE, 3,000 years, a dark age we're only beginning to recognize. The Younger Dryas climate disruption occurred around 10,800 BCE, triggered possibly by cosmic impact or rapid ice sheet collapse. Global temperatures plunged, megafauna went extinct, human populations crashed. The archaeological record shows dramatic cultural disruption across the world during this period, and then gradual recovery, slow rebuilding, the eventual emergence of Neolithic cultures that would develop into the Bronze Age civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China. But what if those Bronze Age civilizations weren't starting from scratch? What if they were rebuilding on foundations laid before the Younger Dryas? What if Göbekli Tepe represents not an anomaly, but evidence of a global predecessor culture that the climate catastrophe destroyed, leaving only fragments preserved in temple archives and mythological narratives about the time before the flood? The flood myths themselves are global. Mesopotamian flood narratives, Egyptian chaos waters, Hindu dissolution floods, Chinese flood legends, Mesoamerican destruction by water, Greek Deucalion flood. These aren't independent inventions. They're cultural memories of actual catastrophes, preserved through oral tradition, and eventually written down when writing systems emerged or were restored after the disasters. And the astronomical knowledge that appears in all these cultures requires centuries, potentially millennia, of observation to compile. You cannot develop accurate precession awareness in a single lifetime, or even a single century. You need institutional continuity, multi-generational observation programs, archives preserving data across time, teacher-student lineages maintaining knowledge transmission. If Bronze Age civilizations developed their astronomical sophistication starting from zero after the Younger Dryas catastrophe, we should see development stages, crude early observations, gradual refinement, increasing accuracy over centuries. But that's not what we find. We find sophisticated astronomy appearing essentially complete. Mula Pin tablets in Mesopotamia, astronomical ceilings in Egypt, Venus tables in Mesoamerica, as though the knowledge was already there, already compiled, already inherited from sources that predated the visible archaeological record. The king lists support this interpretation. They claim explicitly that kingship descended from heaven, that civilization was inherited, not invented, that the current age rebuilt what existed before the flood. They use administrative language to make these claims, treating pre-flood rulers as legitimate predecessors in an unbroken succession that validates contemporary authority. And now we have Göbekli Tepe as physical proof that sophisticated culture existed in the time frame the myths describe. We have flood layers in Mesopotamia as geological proof that catastrophes occurred when the texts say they occurred. We have astronomical knowledge in multiple cultures that requires multi-generational observation, predating those cultures' supposed origins. We have mathematical frameworks, base 60, pi-phi relationships, precessional calculations, appearing complete in the earliest examples we can verify. The evidence accumulates, the pattern clarifies, and the possibility that our standard chronology is incomplete, that it captures only the most recent phase of human civilization, the rebuilding after the most recent catastrophe, becomes harder to dismiss. The Sumerian king list isn't mythology. The Egyptian god dynasties aren't religious fiction. The Mesoamerican creation cycles aren't primitive cosmology. They're institutional memories of actual events, compressed and symbolized perhaps, but preserving truths about civilizational continuity across catastrophic boundaries that we're only beginning to acknowledge as we excavate deeper, date more accurately, and recognize that sophisticated human culture is older and more resilient than we thought. After kingship descended from heaven, it survived the flood. After the gods ruled Egypt, mortal, pharaohs inherited their knowledge. After the wooden people were destroyed by water, the maize people rebuilt using what survived. After the previous yugas collapsed, the current age began with inherited wisdom. The pattern repeats because the pattern is real. Civilization rises. Catastrophe strikes. Survivors preserve what matters. Rebuilding occurs. Knowledge transmits across the boundary. The new age inherits from the old. And the cycle continues, marked in king lists and temple inscriptions and creation myths and astronomical observations, all of them saying the same thing in different cultural languages. We are not the first. We built on foundations laid before us. We inherited knowledge from those who came before the catastrophes. We maintain their archives. We preserve their observations. We rebuild their temples. We are the restoration of what was before. And somewhere in the silence between the myths and the archaeology, between the impossible rain lengths and the verified flood layers, between the inherited mathematics and the buried megaliths, the truth persists. Human civilization is older than we admit, more fragile than we pretend, and more continuous through catastrophe than we've been willing to recognize. The tablets remember, the pyramids preserve, the calendar cycles continue counting, and the inheritance that descended from heaven 4,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, perhaps longer still, that inheritance remains, waiting in museum cases and temple ruins, and astronomical texts for us to recognize what the ancients kept trying to tell us. That we've been here before, that we ended before, that we rebuilt before, and that the knowledge to rebuild again survives in the archives they maintained through the catastrophes we've forgotten, because they understood what we're only beginning to remember. Civilization must be deliberately preserved, or it will be inevitably lost. The flood always comes. The question is whether the knowledge survives. In 2013, archaeologists working at a site called Karahan Tepe in southeastern Turkey, just 30 miles from Göbekli Tepe, uncovered something that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. More megalithic structures, more T-shaped pillars carved with animals and symbols, more evidence of sophisticated stoneworking and astronomical knowledge, dating to approximately 9500 BCE, the same period as Göbekli Tepe. But Karahan Tepe added something Göbekli Tepe hadn't shown as clearly: deliberate preservation architecture. Underground chambers carved directly into bedrock, storage spaces, archive rooms, spaces designed not for habitation but for protection, for keeping something safe across time. The excavation continues. New structures emerge each season, and each discovery pushes the question deeper. What were they preserving? What knowledge mattered enough to carve chambers into living rock, to build massive stone complexes in an age before agriculture, to maintain astronomical observations before cities existed? The standard archaeological response is caution. Don't speculate beyond the evidence. Don't impose modern interpretations on ancient intentions. These were ritual sites, ceremonial centers, gathering places for hunter-gatherer populations who hadn't yet developed the full complexity of civilization. But the precision argues otherwise. The astronomical alignments argue otherwise. The mathematical sophistication embedded in the geometry argues otherwise. And, most significantly, the deliberate burial of both sites argues otherwise. Someone went to enormous effort to build these structures, and then someone went to equally enormous effort to preserve them by burying them completely, creating artificial hills that would protect the stonework for 11,000 years. That's not ritual abandonment. That's archival preservation. That's the same impulse that made Sumerian scribes copy old tablets, that made Egyptian priests rebuild temples on ancient foundations, that made Mayan priests preserve the Popol Vuh through conquest and cultural destruction. The impulse to carry knowledge forward, to maintain continuity across catastrophic boundaries, to ensure that what matters survives even when everything else ends. We're still finding evidence of how recently we almost lost everything we know. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE, accumulated perhaps 500,000 scrolls, the collected knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean world. Mathematics from Babylon, astronomy from Egypt, philosophy from Greece, medical texts from India, geographic knowledge from Phoenician explorers, administrative records from Persian empires, all gathered in one place, catalogued, preserved, available to scholars who traveled from across the known world to access this repository of human knowledge. And then it burned, multiple times, gradually diminishing through accident, neglect, and deliberate destruction until by the 5th century CE nothing remained. 500,000 scrolls, gone. The knowledge they contained survived only in fragments, copies that had been made and distributed to other libraries, quotations preserved in later texts, summaries compiled by scholars before the destruction. We know what we lost because later writers reference works that no longer exist. Manetho's complete Egyptiaca, the full corpus of Aristotle's writings, hundreds of Greek plays, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, engineering principles, gone, recoverable only through indirect evidence, quotations, citations, references in surviving texts that mention what the lost works contained. This is what happens when institutional preservation fails, when archives aren't protected, when knowledge isn't deliberately transmitted across catastrophic boundaries. It simply vanishes. And successor cultures spend centuries trying to reconstruct what was casually destroyed in a few decades of burning. The same pattern repeated throughout history. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, founded in the 8th century CE, became the world's greatest repository of knowledge during the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars translated Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese texts into Arabic. They advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering. They preserved classical knowledge that had been lost in Europe during the collapse of Rome. Then, the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258 CE. The House of Wisdom was destroyed. Books were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the river reportedly ran black with ink. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, mathematical advances, astronomical observations, medical treatises, philosophical works, destroyed in days. Again, we know what we lost only through references in surviving texts. Arab scholars had made significant advances in algebra, had calculated pi to unprecedented precision, had developed sophisticated astronomical instruments, had preserved and extended Greek mathematical knowledge. Most of their original works are gone. We have summaries, translations, and later references, but the complete corpus, the full record of Islamic mathematical and scientific achievement, exists only in fragments. These aren't ancient catastrophes. These aren't mythological floods. These are historical events, well documented, that occurred within the last 2,000 years. And they demonstrate how fragile knowledge preservation is, even with writing, even with institutional structures, even with deliberate efforts to maintain archives. Imagine the same process occurring during the Younger Dryas, global climate catastrophe, populations crashing, cities abandoned, no writing to preserve information, or, if there was writing, no institutions surviving to maintain it. How much would survive? What would the archaeological record show 1,000 years later? 5,000 years later? Probably exactly what we see. Scattered megalithic structures that suggest sophisticated knowledge, but lack the supporting documentary evidence to explain their full context. Astronomical alignments that prove observation capacity, but don't preserve the complete datasets. Mathematical proportions encoded in architecture, but divorced from the calculation methods that produce them. Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe might represent exactly this scenario. The preserved fragments of a predecessor culture that the Younger Dryas destroyed. The deliberately buried archives of a civilization that knew catastrophe was coming and made the choice to preserve what mattered in the only permanent medium available. Carved stone buried deep enough to survive climate chaos, population collapse, and millennia of abandonment. And then, when climate stabilized and populations recovered, the survivors who eventually became Sumerians, Egyptians, and the other Bronze Age civilizations inherited fragments of this older knowledge. Not complete systems, Those were lost when the institutions maintaining them collapsed, but pieces, mathematical frameworks, astronomical observations, architectural principles, enough to rebuild with, to restore, to apply to their own civilizational development. This explains what the king lists claim: kingship descended from heaven, inherited from predecessors. Civilization is restoration, not invention, rebuilt on older foundations. The timescales are cosmic, measuring institutional durations across periods that dwarf individual lifespans, but make sense for long-term astronomical observations or cultural continuity through dark ages. The evidence supports this interpretation more each year. In 2021, researchers analyzing the astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe published findings suggesting the site's Pillar 43, the Vulture Stone, depicts a cosmic catastrophe. The carved symbols appear to represent constellations, as they would have appeared around 10,950 BCE, and they seem to commemorate a comet impact or similar celestial event that would have caused exactly the kind of global catastrophe we see in the geological record at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. If this interpretation is correct, then Göbekli Tepe isn't just an astronomical observatory. It's a memorial, a warning, a record carved in stone of the catastrophe that destroyed whatever civilization existed before it, preserved by survivors who understood that future generations needed to remember what happened so they could prepare for when it happens again. This is knowledge preservation at its most fundamental. Not preserving technical information or mathematical formulas, but preserving the most important knowledge of all. Catastrophes occur. Civilizations end. And if you want what matters to survive, you must deliberately choose to preserve it, because it will not preserve itself. The Sumerian scribes understood this. They copied old tablets even when they didn't fully understand what the old tablets said. They maintained the king list even when the pre-flood rain lengths seemed impossible. They preserved the open astronomical observations even when the calculations stretched back beyond living memory, because they understood their role. Not to create new knowledge, but to transmit old knowledge forward, to maintain the archive that connected them to what came before. The Egyptian priests understood this. They maintained temple archives across 3,000 years. They rebuilt on ancient foundations. They followed plans written in the early primeval age. They told Greek visitors that civilizations rise and fall, but knowledge survives if someone chooses to preserve it through institutional continuity. The Mayan priests understood this. They preserved the Popol Vuh through conquest, translating it into Latin script when their original writing system was being destroyed, ensuring that the memory of previous world ages survived even as their own civilization collapsed under Spanish invasion. And we're beginning to understand it again. We build seed vaults in Arctic permafrost, preserving genetic diversity against future catastrophes. We store data in multiple geographic locations, protecting against regional disasters. We create redundant systems, backup archives, distributed networks. All recognition that knowledge preservation requires deliberate effort, institutional commitment, and the understanding that catastrophes will occur whether we prepare for them or not. The question isn't whether our civilization will end. The pattern suggests all civilizations end eventually. The question is what we preserve for whoever comes after, What knowledge matters enough to protect at any cost? What institutional structures we maintain to carry information across the catastrophic boundary that we know is coming, even if we don't know when? The ancient archives give us a model. Not perfect. Much was lost despite their efforts, but partially successful. Enough survived that we can reconstruct fragments of what they knew. Enough astronomical observations were preserved that we can recognize their sophistication. Enough mathematical frameworks endured that we still use base 60 for time and angles. Enough architectural principles survived that we're still studying their monuments, still trying to understand how they achieved precision we struggle to match. The inheritance is incomplete but real. We received it. We've built upon it. We've added our own observations, our own calculations, our own knowledge. And now we face the same responsibility they faced: preserve what matters for whoever comes after us. Because the archaeological record is clear. The mythological accounts are consistent. The king lists are explicit. Civilizations rise and fall. Catastrophes interrupt human development. And knowledge survives only if someone deliberately chooses to preserve it through the interruption. We've already forgotten how to make Roman concrete that lasts 2,000 years. We've lost the formula for Damascus steel. We've misplaced the complete works of countless scholars, the full records of entire civilizations, the detailed knowledge that made specific achievements possible, not through catastrophe, but through simple neglect, through failing to recognize what mattered, through assuming that what we knew would automatically transmit to the next generation without deliberate effort. The Sumerian scribes knew better. The Egyptian priests knew better. The Mayan priests knew better. They understood that transmission requires institutions, requires training, requires archives, requires the commitment to copy old tablets even when you don't understand them, to rebuild temples on ancient foundations even when you've forgotten why those specific foundations matter, to preserve creation myths even when they describe impossible events. Because somewhere in the preservation is knowledge that future generations will need. And we're proving them right. We're excavating Göbekli Tepe and recognizing astronomical sophistication that shouldn't exist in 9500 BCE. We're translating the Mul-Apen tablets and recognizing observational precision that required centuries to compile. We're surveying the Great Pyramid and recognizing mathematical relationships that demonstrate advanced knowledge. We're reading the king lists and recognizing not mythology, but archival records of institutional memory. The inheritance descended from heaven. It survived the flood. It persisted through dark ages. It rebuilt after catastrophes. And it reached us, imperfect, fragmentary, compressed into myth and encoded in monuments, but recognizable if we learn to read what the ancients were preserving. Which brings us back to that phrase on the Nippur tablet, copied 4,000 years ago from sources even older. This is the restoration of what was before. We're still restoring, still rebuilding on ancient foundations, still inheriting knowledge from sources we don't fully understand, still discovering that our innovations are often rediscoveries, that our advances sometimes recover ground that was lost, that the cutting edge occasionally cuts backward through time to reveal that someone before us already knew what we're just learning. The base 60 system that descended from heaven still measures our seconds. The astronomical observations compiled before the flood still inform our understanding of precession. The architectural principles encoded in ancient pyramids still inspire modern engineering. The mathematical relationships carved in stone still teach us geometry. The archive is still speaking. We're still learning to listen. And the silence between what they preserved and what we've forgotten, between what descended from heaven and what we've built ourselves, between restoration and innovation, grows quieter with each excavation that reveals older sophistication. Each translation that recovers lost knowledge, each recognition that maybe the ancients were telling the truth, maybe kingship did descend from heaven, knowledge inherited from predecessors who came before the catastrophes. Maybe the god dynasties represent real institutional continuity across timescales we're only beginning to acknowledge. Maybe the creation cycles describe actual events compressed into mythology, because mythology was the only preservation medium that survived. Maybe we're not the first to reach this level of complexity. Maybe others came before us, built sophisticated civilizations, developed astronomical knowledge and mathematical frameworks and architectural principles, and then faced catastrophes that destroyed everything except what they deliberately chose to preserve. And maybe we're still using what they preserved, still building on their foundations, still restoring what was before, even when we think we're innovating, even when we claim to be inventing, even when we've forgotten that inheritance underlies everything we know. The tablets are still being found. The chambers at Karahan Tepe are still being excavated. The layers are still being analyzed. The inheritance is still being traced. And somewhere in the quiet between what we know and what we've forgotten, the pattern continues. Civilization rises, knowledge accumulates, institutions preserve, catastrophe strikes, survivors carry forward, rebuilding occurs, restoration happens, the inheritance descends, from heaven to earth, from the before time to the after time, from the gods to the demigods to the mortal kings who rule us now, an unbroken succession maintained through catastrophes we're only beginning to remember, through dark ages we're only starting to detect, through transitions from cosmic time to human time that the king lists mark but never fully explain. The archive endures, if we choose to maintain it, if we recognize its value, if we commit to the same preservation duty that Sumerian scribes and Egyptian priests and Mayan councils understood was their primary purpose: to carry knowledge forward, to preserve what matters, to ensure that when the catastrophe comes, and the pattern suggests it will come, something survives, something worth rebuilding from, something descended from heaven. The clay tablet rests in its museum case, 4,000 years since the scribe pressed his stylus into wet earth, forming wedges that would outlast empires. The signs are still legible, the numbers are still clear. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. We've traced the pattern across continents and millennia, from Mesopotamian flood layers to Egyptian temple foundations, from Göbekli Tepe's buried chambers to Mayan calendar cycles, from base 60 mathematics that still measures our time to astronomical knowledge that required centuries of institutional observation. The evidence points consistently toward the same conclusion. Civilization is older than we've admitted, more fragile than we'd like to believe, and more continuous through catastrophe than our standard chronologies acknowledge. The king lists aren't mythology. They're constitutional documents maintaining institutional memory across the deepest boundaries human history has known. They preserve what the catastrophes tried to erase, the knowledge that civilizations existed before, that they ended, that survivors carried forward what mattered, that rebuilding required inheritance from those who came before. 8 kings before the flood, divine dynasties in Egypt stretching back 9,000 years from Plato's time. Mayan creation cycles describing multiple destroyed humanities. Hindu yugas measuring cosmic time in the same base numbers that governed Sumerian administrative records. The pattern repeats because the pattern is real. Catastrophes occur. Climate shifts. Impacts happen. Floods rise. Populations crash. Cities fall. And in the aftermath, the question isn't whether civilization can rebuild. The question is whether the knowledge to rebuild survives, whether someone preserved it, whether institutions maintained it, whether scribes copied the old tablets even when the numbers seemed impossible, whether priests rebuilt on ancient foundations even when they'd forgotten why those foundations mattered. The Sumerians understood this. The Egyptians understood this. The Mayans understood this. They built preservation into their core institutional purpose, not just building temples but maintaining archives, not just ruling but transmitting, not just creating but restoring what was before. And what they preserved reached us. Imperfectly, in fragments, compressed into myths we dismissed as primitive cosmology, encoded in monuments we attributed to human ingenuity alone, buried in tablets we're still translating, in chambers we're still excavating, in astronomical alignments we're still measuring, in mathematical relationships we're still discovering, the inheritance that descended from heaven 4,000 years ago, or 10,000, or longer still, that inheritance remains. In the seconds we count using base 60. In the degrees we measure on the same sexagesimal framework. In the astronomical observations that track precession using cycles the ancients already knew. In the architectural principles we study in pyramids we still can't fully explain. We're still restoring what was before, still building on foundations we didn't lay, still inheriting knowledge from sources that predated us by millennia. The scribes are still speaking through the tablets they preserved. The builders are still teaching through the monuments they aligned. The priests are still warning through the catastrophe narratives they maintained. The archive is still there, still speaking, still waiting for us to recognize what it's been saying all along. We've been here before. We ended before. We rebuilt before. And the knowledge to rebuild again survives in what they chose to preserve through the catastrophes we've forgotten. The tablets are still being found. New chambers emerge at Karahan-Tepe each season. Flood layers reveal themselves in excavations from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. Astronomical alignments encode knowledge we're only beginning to decode. And the pattern persists. Inheritance, restoration, continuity through catastrophe. Knowledge transmitted across boundaries that should have been terminal, but somehow weren't. Because they made the choice to copy, to preserve, to transmit, to carry forward what mattered even when everything else ended. The scribe's hand pressing into clay, the priest rebuilding on ancient stone, the council preserving the sacred text through conquest. The same purpose across cultures and millennia: maintain the archive, preserve the knowledge, ensure the inheritance descends from heaven to earth, from the before time to the after time, from the impossible reign lengths to the mortal present. The chain remains unbroken if we choose to maintain it. If you're still listening, I'd like to know where you are and what time it is. Leave a comment. Let this quiet stretch across the world, just as it did when those first scribes pressed their wedges into clay, copying from archives we're only beginning to understand. The tablets are still speaking. The inheritance is still descending. And somewhere in the silence between what they preserved and what we've forgotten, the pattern continues, waiting for us to remember that civilization must be deliberately preserved, or it will be inevitably lost, that the knowledge matters more than we know, that the archive is our inheritance, and that restoration of what was before isn't optional. It's the only way forward we've ever had.